Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. I'm Ranger Rick. Yeah, laugh it up. And I'm out here in the backwoods of Kentucky, keeping an eye on our national forests. It's a pretty sweet gig most days, you know. Fresh air, wildlife, all that jazz. But today was not one of those days. The call came in mid-morning. Some flyboys in a chopper thought they saw something weird. Way out there, deep in a valley, miles from any public trail, an unmarked camp. Said it looked messy. So, naturally, yours truly got sent in to check it out. Let me tell you, messy was the understatement of the century. This place was a bloodbath. Streaks of it everywhere. Like someone had taken a bucket of red paint and just flung it around. And the smell, oh man, the smell. Coppery, thick, and just wrong. It didn't take long for the buzzards to show up, and then the beers started circling. This whole scene was fresh, like really fresh. I started poking around, trying to make sense of things. And that's when I found it. A notebook lying near what was left of a campfire, splattered with blood, but still readable. I flipped it open, my gut already churning. I started with the last entry, reading aloud as I walked, trying to piece together what the hell happened here. I'm gonna leave out some of the guy's ramblings. Trust me, there was a lot of weird stuff about drugs that didn't make much sense. But the rest of it, I gotta get this out there. December 13th, between houses, is probably the nicest way to put it. I'm Bill, by the way. Lost my job, then my place. Landlord wasn't too happy about the 3 months of back rent. Go figure. Never thought I'd end up backpacking, especially not in the dead of winter. But hey, here I am. Everything I own is strapped to my back, and this national forest seemed as good a place as any to lay low for a while. I hiked up a mountain, through the thickest woods you ever saw, and after about 15 miles, I found this clearing. It was perfect. A little valley surrounded by trees, with a small lake in the middle. This was it, I thought, my new home. I set up camp, threw out a couple of fishing lines, managed to snag a few trout, enough for dinner anyway. Roasted them over the fire that night. It was simple, but honestly, it was the best meal I'd had in months. At that point, it was all I could ask for. Part 2, The Shadow, December 18th. That's when I first saw him. The Shadow. A few days after I got here, he was standing at the edge of the woods, on the other side of the lake. Just a dark figure, not moving. I waved, figured it was another camper, maybe someone else down on their luck like me. But he didn't budge. Now, my eyesight ain't what it used to be. I'm pushing 55, so I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light. Every time I went over there to check it out, he was gone. Didn't think much of it. Figured maybe the mountain air was messing with me. December 20th, he showed up in my camp. I was building a fire, and as the flames started to grow, I saw him. Sitting right across from me, like he was just waiting for me to say hello. But he was completely still, like a statue. It freaked me out. I yelled at him, told him to get lost, and poof. Gone. Just like that. I started to wonder if I was losing it. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, or maybe this whole thing was something else. I'd never been a big believer in ghosts and all that, but I was starting to have my doubts. The next day, I decided to follow the path the shadow man always seemed to take. Around the lake, into the woods. Didn't see him, but I kept going. Pushed my way through this thick patch of thorns. It was like a wall of briars, I swear. Finally, I came out into another clearing higher up, but something felt off. The trees stopped growing in a perfect circle, and in the center was this door. It wasn't like a regular door. It was heavy, like it was made of solid iron, and it was set into this big concrete slab that was sticking out of the ground. Weird, right? I felt this weird tightness in my chest, and my breathing got all ragged. I figured it was just the hike, or maybe I was allergic to something up there. Then a breeze picked up, and I looked over at the door as it swung wide open. And there he was, the shadow, just standing there. That was it. I had to know. I was in this deep, and I was seeing it through. I shouldn't have gone down that hallway. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Part 3, The Descent, December 21st. I went back to that door today. It led to this long staircase, going down into the earth, pitch black. Grabbed a lantern after dinner and went in. December 27th, I've been exploring down there, using what little light I have. Haven't seen the shadow guy, but I guess he wouldn't exactly stand out in the dark, would he? Man, I should have put on more sunscreen. I'm burning up out here. Gonna try to stay out of the sun today. Won't be much of a problem with that. I went deep down these weird hallways. They're all jagged, like spikes or something, and the signs, they're creepy, symbols and stuff mixed in with English. Basic, keep out, warnings, like you'd see on any ranch back home. December 23rd, cut up some blood last night. I don't feel terrible, but I've got this awful burn. I needed to go back down there, and I did. Went further this time. I tied a rope to the door so I could find my way back, and just kept going. It was just dirt, more dirt. At the end of the hall, there's this little metal ball. Tried to touch it, but it was hot. Must be some kind of weird fluke. I'll go back tomorrow. December 24th, Christmas Eve. What a joke. God hasn't given me squat, and we're supposed to worship him. Nah, I'm going back in. Last night, I woke up in agony. My hands were throbbing. The skin was peeling off, and I had these bruises all over. It felt like a burn, a really bad one. Part 4, The Warning, December 25th. My body is falling apart. I didn't sleep. Not a wink. My right index finger, it was throbbing. My other hand just went on autopilot. I grabbed that finger, and it was like squeezing a wet sock. Blood gushed out, and my fingernail just came off. It just laid there in my hand. I wrapped it up as good as I could. I don't think I feel pain anymore after that. The way I see it, I'm dying anyway. Might as well see what that thing is while I'm at it. This is it. My last message. If you find this, get out of here. You don't want this. I ain't coming out of that cave. Learn from me. That last entry was barely legible, scrawled in what I realized was his own blood. It had soaked through the last few lines. He wrote what was on the walls. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to see for myself. I went back to that clearing, up through the thorns, and there it was. The door, with the shadow sitting right on top. It was real. A part of me thought old Bill had just gone crazy, but I saw that thing plain as day, or as plain as a shadow can be. I went inside down the hallway, and there it was, a pool of blood. But it wasn't just a pool, it was him, Bill. Or what was left of him. Bones sticking out, muscles all fused together. He was barely human anymore, just this mass. I shined my flashlight around, then back at the notebook. The light caught the pen ink under the dried blood. I read it, matching the words to the English scrawled on the walls. This place is a message. Pay attention to it. Sending this message was important to us. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. This one place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing valued is here. What is here is dangerous and repulsive too. This is a message about danger. The danger is unleashed only if you substantially disturb this place physically. This place is best shunned and left uninhabited. 3. Those words, they struck a chord. I'd heard them somewhere before, but I couldn't place it. Then I saw the symbol, like a pinwheel, 3 arms spinning out from the center. That's when it hit me. I ran like hell. By the time I got back to my truck, I was covered in blisters. My face felt like it was on fire. I've been around forest fires, and they were nothing compared to this. I made it to town, but I collapsed at the wheel. Doctor says I've got a week, tops. But I know I won't last a day. Cancer, they say. I don't know if this is a goodbye. I don't know if I have it in me to do what needs to be done. But I gotta leave something behind. Some kind of warning. Stay away from those clearings in the mountains. They kill you slow, but they kill you just the same. Stay away from Ranger Rick's neck of the woods. Just stay away. My name's Justin, and I gotta get this off my chest. It's been messing with my head since it happened last weekend, and I'm still not sure if I even believe it myself. But here's the thing, it wasn't just me. My 2 friends, Mark and Chloe, were there too, and we all remember it the same freaking way. So, picture this, we'd just survived the hell week that is midterms. Me, Mark, and Chloe. We were desperate for a break, you know. Some fresh air, some trees, maybe a campfire or 2. Classic college kid road trip stuff. We're talking cheap snacks, a half-decent playlist, and a tent that probably had a hole in it. We just wanted to get out of the city, drive upstate, and sleep under the stars for a couple of nights. We piled into Mark's beat, up old car, may she rest in peace, and hit the road. We were cruising along, windows down, singing along to some throwbacks, just enjoying the freedom. We drove for hours, the kind of drive where you lose all track of time, just watching the scenery blur by. It was getting late, and we were somewhere off the main highway. My phone hadn't had service in ages. Mark, who was driving, missed the exit we were supposed to take. No big deal, right? Happens all the time. Except instead of, turning around like a normal person, he decides he's gonna take a shortcut. I swear, this guy's sense of direction is worse than a goldfish's. Chloe, from the back seat, spots this little road branching off to the right. It was barely more than a dirt track, almost completely hidden by these overgrown trees. As a joke, she goes, Ooh, let's take the creepy, dark road. What could go wrong? I don't know if we were just tired, or delirious from the drive, or maybe we just had a collective brain fart. But Mark actually took the turn. He swerved onto this narrow, winding path, and the trees just closed in around us like, bam, instant darkness. It was like driving into the mouth of some giant, leafy monster. We started cracking jokes, calling it horror movie lane, and laughing about how we were gonna end up as characters in some backwoods slasher flick. But the jokes died down pretty quick when we started noticing how weird the trees were. I'm telling you, these trees were wrong. They were all twisted and gnarled, like they'd been strangled or something. The branches were bent at these crazy angles, reaching out like claws, and on the trunks, there were these deep, raw scratch marks, like something huge had just raked its claws down the bark. We're talking deep gouges here, fresh ones, and the silence. Man, the silence was the worst. No birds, no crickets, no nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath, watching us. We rolled down the windows, hoping for a breeze, anything to break the stillness, but the air was just stale and cold. Way colder than it should have been. It was like driving into a freezer. We started to get a really bad feeling about this place. It was only after a few minutes that we saw something truly concerning, and it would change everything. We keep driving, the road getting worse and worse, and then we see it, a clearing. And in the middle of the clearing, there's this old, run-down building. Looks like an abandoned ranger station or something. Weird, because there were no trails leading to it, no signs, nothing on any map we had. It was like it just popped up out of nowhere. And the freakiest part, the lights were on. Just one single, flickering yellow bulb above the door, casting this sickly glow on the porch. Now, any sane person would have turned around right then and there. But us, nope. We were three idiots, fueled by bad decisions and maybe a little bit of morbid curiosity. We parked the car and Mark, ever the brave one, was like, well, we're here. Might as well check it out. Baclo wasn't thrilled, but she definitely didn't want to be left alone in the car with those creepy trees. So, like lambs to the slaughter, the three of us crept towards the station, the only sound being the crunching of leaves under our feet. And that silence was back now, a suffocating blanket. It made the hairs on my arms stand up straight. We felt like we were being watched by a million unseen eyes. This is where it all went sideways. This is where things got unreal. So, we're standing on the porch of this creepy ranger station, and the closer we get, the worse it smells. Like, seriously rank. It hit us in waves, this mix of mildew, rotting wood, and something metallic, like old blood. My stomach did a flip-flop, and I swear I almost threw up right there. We pushed the door open, it wasn't even locked, and stepped inside. The smell got even worse. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was dust thick enough to write your name in, cobwebs everywhere, and furniture that was falling apart. Papers were scattered all over the floor, like someone had ransacked the place. It was straight up post-apocalyptic vibes. But in the middle of the room, there was something that made my blood run cold. A map. A huge, hand-drawn map of the forest, pinned to the wall. It was all yellowed and faded, but you could still make out the details. And there were these weird symbols drawn around certain areas, like some kind of code. And get this, some of the symbols were smeared with this dark, reddish-brown stuff. It looked suspiciously like dried blood. My gut was screaming at me to get out of there, but my eyes were glued to the map. Around it were all these old Polaroid pictures, pinned up like they were important. I took a closer look at the photos, and that's when I really started to freak out. They were all blurry, like they'd been taken in a hurry, but you could still make out what they were showing. Figures, things, shapes that definitely weren't human. They were tall and distorted, with limbs that were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Like, imagine a stick figure drawn by a 5-year-old but terrifying. And their faces were just blank, smooth. No eyes, no mouth, no nothing. Just a blank, featureless void where a face should be. Mark, being the fearless idiot he is, started walking closer to the map, like he was in a trance or something. But the second he took a step, we heard it. This low, guttural growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep and distorted, like it was coming from the bottom of a well, and it sent shivers down my spine. It was coming from outside, somewhere close to the station. "Guys, we need to get out of here," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. She was finally on the same page, thank goodness. I was already backing away from the map, my heart pounding in my chest. But then, the door we'd left wide open slammed shut. We all jumped, spinning around to stare at it, and that's when the growling started again. Closer this time, right outside the walls. We were trapped. We huddled together, backing away from the door, trying to figure out what to do. That's when we saw it through the grimy window. A figure moving through the trees. It was tall, way taller than any person had a right to be, and it was skinny, like impossibly skinny, with those long, spindly arms that reached almost to the ground, and the face, that blank, featureless face. It was just like the photos. One of those things was out there in the woods, and it was coming towards the station. Panic set in. Real, gut-wrenching, can't-breathe panic. We were gonna die here. I just knew it. Mark grabbed my arm and yanked me towards the back of the station. "There's gotta be another way out," he yelled, his voice surprisingly steady. We stumbled through a doorway into a narrow hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. We found another door, at the end of the hall, a back door, maybe, and burst through it, not even bothering to look back. We ran. We ran like hell. We didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running through the woods. Branches whipping at our faces, the sound of that thing crashing through the underbrush behind us. It was like a nightmare, only it was real. It was hunting us, and it was getting closer. The growls were louder now, closer, and we could hear the snapping of branches as it tore through the forest after us. That thing was fast. Too fast. And we were just 3 terrified college kids, running for our lives from something we didn't understand, something that shouldn't even exist. We ran through the darkness, dodging trees and tripping over roots. I don't know how long we ran or how far. All I know is that my lungs were burning. My legs were screaming, and that thing was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, hunting us. We were tearing through the woods, no plan, just pure blind panic. Branches clawed at our clothes and faces, but we didn't slow down. The growls were right behind us, echoing through the trees, and the sound of that thing crashing through the undergrowth was getting closer. It was like something out of a horror movie. Except we weren't watching it, we were living it. I don't know how long we ran like that. Time seemed to stretch and compress, each second an eternity, each heartbeat a drumbeat of terror. My lungs felt like they were on fire, my legs were turning to jelly, but I forced myself to keep going. We had to get out of there. We had to escape. Eventually, through sheer luck or maybe divine intervention, the sounds behind us started to fade. We risked a glance back and saw, to our immense relief, that we'd lost it. We stumbled out of the dense trees and found ourselves, miraculously, back on the main road near Mark's car. The clearing, the ranger station, the terrifying map, they were gone. Vanished, like they'd never even existed. We scrambled to the car, fumbling with the keys in our desperation. Chloe was sobbing, Mark was hyperventilating, and I was pretty sure I was in shock. We piled into the car, and Mark floored it, peeling out of there like a bat out of hell. The road stretched out in front of us, dark and empty. For a moment, just a moment, I thought we were safe. We'd made it. We were going to be okay. Then Chloe screamed. I whipped around to see what she was pointing at, and my stomach dropped into my shoes. In the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, was that figure. That tall, impossibly thin silhouette with the blank face. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was just there, watching us. No matter how fast Mark drove, it stayed in view. Every twist and turn, every bend in the road, it was still there, getting bigger, closer. It was like it was toying with us, letting us think we could escape before reeling us back in. Then the car started acting up. The headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered, like it was choking. No, Nark yelled, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. Not now, not when we were so close. The car coughed one last time and died, right there in the middle of the road. We were sitting ducks. The only light came from the weak beam of Chloe's phone flashlight and the pale glow of the moon. We could see the figure approaching in the rearview mirror, its movement slow, deliberate. It was in no hurry. It knew it had us. Stay in the car, Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew it was pointless. That thing was coming for us, and there was nowhere left to run. We were trapped in a metal box, waiting for that creature to reach us. We could hear it now, its slow, deliberate steps getting closer. It was no longer just a shape in the mirror, it was real, and it was coming. Panic seized us again. We had to get out of the car. We couldn't just sit there and wait for it to get us. So, we did the only thing we could think of. We ran. Again. We threw open the car doors and bolted back into the woods, not knowing where we were going, not caring. We just had to get away from that thing. My legs were screaming in protest, my lungs burning, but I pushed on, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. I could hear Chloe and Mark ahead of me, their panicked breaths barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. We were running blind, crashing through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks. And then it happened. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I don't know, and I went down. Hard. I landed on my knee with a sickening crunch, pain shooting up my leg like a bolt of lightning. I tried to get up, but my leg wouldn't cooperate. It was like it was on fire, and I couldn't put any weight on it. I was lying there, helpless, the sounds of the forest closing in around me, when I saw it. The figure, stepping into the faint light of a small clearing where I had fallen. It was even more terrifying up close. Taller than I'd imagined, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones. Those long, spindly arms twitched at its sides, ending in hands with fingers that were way too long, tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. And that face, that smooth, blank face, with no features at all. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. It tilted its head, almost curiously, as it looked down at me. I could hear its breathing, or maybe it was my own, shallow and ragged. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. I was going to die here, in the middle of nowhere, killed by something that shouldn't even exist. Its clawed hand reached towards me, slow and deliberate. That clawed hand was inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end. A silent scream trapped in my throat. This was it. I was going to die here, alone, ripped apart by this thing. Then, out of nowhere, a sound cut through the silence, a roar, but human this time. Mark. He came barreling out of the darkness like a linebacker, wielding a thick, heavy branch like a weapon. He swung it with all his might, connecting with the creature's arm with a sickening crack. The thing let out a shriek, a sound I'll never forget. It was like static and nails on a chalkboard, mixed with the roar of some wild animal. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated evil. The creature stumbled back, clutching its arm, and Mark seized the opportunity. He grabbed me under my arms and hauled me up, practically dragging me back into the woods. My injured leg was on fire, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to move. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping me going. Chloe was waiting for us near the road, her phone flashlight beam dancing frantically. "Come on, come on," she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. We burst out of the woods and back to the car. And here's where things get even weirder, the engine. It was dead just a minute ago, right? But when Mark turned the key, it roared to life, like nothing had ever happened. We didn't hesitate. We scrambled back into the car, slammed the doors, and Mark peeled out, leaving that horrific figure behind in the darkness. We drove for hours, not stopping, not talking, just putting as much distance as possible between us and that place. We didn't even know where we were going, we just drove. Even now, back in the relative safety of my own home, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. My leg is healing, slowly but surely, but the scratch marks on Mark's car are still there, a constant, chilling reminder of what we saw. They haven't faded one bit. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel like I'm being watched. I catch glimpses of shadows out of the corner of my eye, shapes that don't quite look human. And at night, I hear things. Faint, distorted growls outside my window, like something's out there, waiting. I don't know what that thing was, or what it wanted. I don't know if it was a figment of our imaginations, some shared hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. Or maybe it was something else, something unexplainable. All I know is that we took a wrong turn, and we found ourselves in a place where the normal rules didn't apply. A place where the trees are wrong, the air is cold, and things with blank faces hunt you in the darkness. We escape, but a part of me will always be trapped back there, in that forest, running for my life. And I know, deep down, that I'll never truly be free of that night. It's changed me, it's changed all of us. Sometimes I can still smell that awful stench from the ranger station, and every so often I will look at old Polaroid pictures and wonder about those blurry figures in them. We never went back to that place. We never spoke about it to anyone else. Who would believe us? They'd lock us up in a padded room. But it happened. I know it did. We all know it did. 3 of us saw it. 3 of us lived it. And we'll carry that terror with us for the rest of our lives. So, yeah, that's my story. Believe it or not, it's the truth. Or at least, it's our truth. And that's enough to keep me up at night, staring out the window, wondering if that thing is still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting, and wondering if it remembers us too. And sometimes when the wind is just right, the silence outside will return, and I'll wonder if that thing is slowly making its way towards me. I was sprinting through the woods like a bat out of hell. Branches whipping at me, roots trying to trip me up, my heart pounding like a drum solo gone wild. My lungs were burning, screaming for air, but I couldn't stop. Couldn't even think. My own ragged breathing was all I could hear, echoing in my skull, drowning out everything else. And then, bam, something slams into me, sending me flying into a freaking tree. Next thing I know, I'm face down in the dirt, seeing stars, blood everywhere, no idea where it's even coming from. This huge dark shadow looms over me. Then I woke up. Turns out, it was just a nightmare. A messed up preview of what was about to go down. At the time, it felt so real, it shook me up bad. But, honestly, I was already shaken. See, my dog, Max, my best bud in the whole world, he died 2 weeks before. I was a wreck, nowhere near over it. Max was my family. 14 years we had together. He had a good run, though. A real good life. My wife, Sarah, and I, we never had kids, so Max was our baby. Yeah, I was married, but Sarah passed away 2 years ago. I'll never get over that. Never. So, there I was, lying in bed, not wanting to move a muscle. I was in this weird, zombie-like depression for days. Didn't want to do anything but lie there and binge, watch whatever crap would make me forget, even if just for a little while. Work was expecting me back the next week. How the hell was I supposed to do that? I was seriously thinking about just quitting. But, hey, that was a problem for future me. Right then, I had an anniversary to deal with. So, I peeled my sorry self out of bed. First, I picked up Max's ashes from the crematorium. He was a solid 50-pound blue healer. Got home, split those ashes in 2. Half were gonna stay at our place, the other half were coming with me. Next, I loaded up my little SUV and drove off into the wilderness. We lived on the edge of this massive forest. I mean, huge. Some of it was BLM land, some private, some national park. It was this crazy patchwork that went on for miles and miles. It took me about 3 hours of driving to get where I was going. This super remote campsite on BLM land. It was Max's favorite spot in the world. At least, that's what I always figured. We used to come here with Sarah all the time. Those were the days. The campsite was only like a 30-yard walk from where I parked. I set up a little fire pit and a tent. Figured I'd just stay the one night. See, 3 years ago, on that exact day, before Sarah got sick, the sky was insane. Stars everywhere, plus this epic meteor shower. We were sitting there, Sarah, Max, and me, just watching the show. The three of us, just chilling there for hours, soaking it all in. Sarah and I would hoot and holler, and Max would bark at the best shooting stars. So, the plan was to wait until dark and spread Max's ashes there, along with a little bit of Sarah's. I brought a cot, some food, and my revolver with a bunch of ammo. I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere. Closest ranger station was probably 200 miles away. Grizzlies, mountain lions, they were around, but I was always more worried about the people who didn't want to be found. Maybe I was becoming one of them. I'd been having all these dark thoughts lately, about my purpose, about whether I even wanted to be here anymore. My parents, well, they were alive, but they weren't in the picture. Let's just say they were toxic. One was a narcissistic jerk, the other a manipulative witch. Cutting them out was the best decision I ever made, but now I was really alone. My grandparents were gone, and my parents had stopped talking to their side of the family ages ago. It was like they wanted our family line to just end. Yeah, my family was messed up. Sarah and Max, they were my everything. Sarah had lost her parents young, too. I had a few friends, I guess. My best friend, Ben. He moved across the country for a job last year. You could say I was in a pretty dark place. That night I drank, I watched the stars. Then I spread Max and Sarah's ashes, and yeah, I cried a lot. It was like a dam broke. I hadn't really been crying the last few days, but before that, every single day since I found out about Max's cancer. I guess it was all bottled up and I just exploded. It helped me sleep, though. That, and a lighter of Jack Daniels. I can't remember now if the noise woke me up, or if I woke up and then heard it. But it was this loud crash. Glass breaking. Sounded like it was coming from my car, like someone was smashing the windshield. Then, this heavy bungee, like something was hitting the metal, denting it. It didn't sound good. Not at all. The noise just kept going, like someone was going to town on my car. More glass shattering. I grabbed my gun and peeked out of the tent. There was a half moon, so it wasn't pitch black, but I couldn't see much under the trees. My campfire was dead. I'd put it out earlier. My car was still getting wrecked. I thought about firing my gun in the air, or maybe getting closer to see what was going on. So, I fired Pope. 3 shots into the air. I quickly reloaded the 5 chambers. I grabbed a handful of bullets, shoved them in my pocket, and grabbed my phone. The noise at my car stopped. Dead silence. I stood there, just inside my tent, head, gun, and phone camera poking out. Scanning the area. The silence was creepy. Not a sound. Then a creak. Something whizzed right past my head, fast and loud. Then another one. And it hit me. Something was throwing things at me. and that's when I got nailed, right in the shoulder. I fell back into the tent, shoulder on fire. I saw what hit me as it rolled across the floor. It was a rock, about the size of a baseball. My phone was on the ground next to it, screen totally shattered. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Something was charging at my tent. It was pure adrenaline that kicked in. I scrambled up, went to the tent opening, and looked out. This hairy, man-shaped shadow was sprinting at me. I fired off 3 rounds right at it. I think one hit it. I was a pretty decent shot, used to go to the range regularly. The thing, whatever it was, swerved and crashed into some nearby bushes. It stayed there, hidden in a thick patch of dark green. But then another rock ripped out of the darkness, heading straight for me. I ducked, and I swear I felt it graze my ear as it zipped past, like some kind of demonic hummingbird. I fired my last 2 rounds at the spot where the rock came from. Then, I quickly reloaded and fired off 5 more. Reloaded again and waited, watching the bushes sway slightly in the wind, their branches clicking together like skeletal fingers. Nothing moved. It felt like an eternity passed. Finally, I yelled out, "Who are you?" I know, super lame, right? But I think I just kept repeating it over and over. I was laser focused on those shadows. But then this awful sound came from there. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard either. It was a cry, a wail, and then it cried out even louder. That's when I heard another one, another cry, but deeper, from somewhere else in the forest. The thing closer to me stopped making noise. The cry from the distance rang out again, but this time it sounded desperate. The one near me didn't respond. The distant cry came again, more frantic now. The only reply it got was 2 other distant, different cries. It hit me then, there were at least 3 more of these things out there, and they were all around me. I knew I had to get the hell out of there. I threw on my shoes and grabbed my backpack, stuffing things in as fast as I could. I thought about running to my car, but the silent, possibly injured thing was right between me and my SUV. Still, I was gonna make a run for it, but then I hesitated. Could it be a trap? The whole situation was just so insane. My whole life, I'd kind of wanted to see a Bigfoot, and now I was under attack by a whole group of them. It felt like the universe was just messing with me, trying to finish me off. Maybe I should have just taken the hint right there. Instead, I scooped up my busted phone, took it with me even though the screen was toast, readied my gun, and ran toward my car. As I moved past the bushes, I saw it. The thing sprawled out on the ground. Even though its fur was dark, I could see it was soaked with something wet on its chest. Red, blood. It wasn't moving. I stopped dead in my tracks. Crazy as it sounds, I had to get a better look. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This thing had to be some kind of missing link, right? It had dark brown fur, was easily over 6 feet tall, and probably weighed around 220 pounds. Lean but muscular. Long arms, a heavy brow ridge, and a snout like a gorilla. And it wasn't moving at all. I was pretty sure it was dead. I fumbled with my phone. I could tell it was still on, even though the screen was wrecked. I tried double-clicking the side button, which usually brings up the camera. I tapped the screen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the camera lens was okay, and it would snap a picture. A terrifying howl ripped through the night like a clap of thunder. It came from close by. Really close. I spun around and saw it. A larger silhouette of another one of these things, about 15 yards away. It was standing next to my car, and it was staring right at me. I froze. I remember squeezing my gun so hard my fingernails dug into my palm. The thing just stood there, then it charged, moving like a giant ape, and flipped my car over like it was a toy. The crazy thing is, at that moment, all I could think was that Sarah and I should have really bought the one I wanted, a much heavier Ford Bronco. I fired my gun into the air. All 5 rounds. The thing froze again, just watching me like some kind of statue. I quickly reloaded. Then I heard them. 2 more, coming out of the woods, heading straight for me. I was still reloading and dropped a couple of bullets in my panic. I thought about shooting at them, but they were surrounding me. I had one way out. Another rock whizzed past my head, so I took off. I bolted into the denser part of the woods. Luckily, it was pretty flat. The things were right behind me. I ran maybe 50, 60 yards. Somehow I was pulling away a little, but my cardio was crap. I knew if I had to keep running, I was done for. One of them was faster than the others. It kept getting closer, and I'd fire at it, and it would quickly dodge behind trees. I could hear rocks whistling around me. One hit me in the back, I think, but my backpack took the brunt of it. Then I reached the edge of this big pool of water, all tangled with tall grass. A bog. I stayed along the edge of the murky swamp and kept running. I could hear the things shrieking as they chased me. They kept throwing rocks. I was firing back wildly, but I couldn't get a clean shot. One of them was always chucking rocks or trying to flank me. They were picking up their pace, and I was slowing down. One of them must have grabbed a handful of smaller rocks, because I felt them pelting me. They were closing in. I made a split-second decision and plunged into the bog, knee deep in the muck. The edge of the water was like thick, muddy soup. There was clearer water further in. The things, agitated and shrieking, stayed at the edge of the water. They kept throwing rocks as I waded quickly toward deeper water, firing back at them. Then they jumped in. I tucked my gun away, tossed off my backpack, and dove into the deeper water. I started swimming as hard as I could. I used to swim a lot when I was a kid. I reached the other side of the bog and scrambled out. And that's when I realized it. My gun was gone. It must have slipped out when I dove in. The things were coming out of the water right behind me. I ran, pushing through even darker, denser wetlands, dodging branches, jumping over soggy bushes. Then I slipped. I fell down a small ravine, slamming into a huge fallen tree. It was massive, decomposing. Other fallen trees were leaning against it, lodged into the ground, creating a hollow space underneath, a tight crawl space, a place to hide. I quickly scrambled down into the hollow. Inside, I squeezed myself into the small cave made of mud, dirt, and twisted roots. I went quiet. As quiet as humanly possible. I could hear the things enter the area. At least 2 of them. They slowed down. I heard their footsteps, breaking branches. They were getting closer to the fallen trees, closer to the hollow where I was hiding. I peeked out and saw one of them less than 10 feet away. Not wanting to be trapped, I quickly slid and tumbled out of the hollow and hid behind another rotting tree trunk. I hid in a patch of ferns. I thought for sure it saw me, but it didn't. I watched it look into the hollow, even crawl inside a little. The other one was scanning the area, and for a second, I thought our eyes met. I closed my eyes and lay still in the mud. I was covered in slime and muck. I hoped I blended in with the ground. I heard it moving closer. Slow, careful steps, barely making a sound, but I knew it was there. I kept my eyes closed, my cheek pressed into the dirt. It kept coming closer. Then I heard the other one, closer now too. They were on either side of me, closing in. As they got nearer, I thought about jumping up, making a run for it. But then something else hit me. Did I even care if I died? I'd been wrestling with that question ever since Sarah passed. But then I had Max, my reason to keep going, to take care of him. But when he left me, I thought about just standing up, letting them have me, letting them rip me apart, tear me limb from limb, or smash my skull with a giant rock. Maybe it would be quick. Maybe it would be slow and agonizing. I honestly didn't know if I cared anymore. Then I heard it. The loud crack of a branch breaking under a heavy weight. They were right next to me. I peeked open one eye and saw this huge, matted, hairy foot right in front of my face. I was just about to get up, to accept my fate. But then, as if she were right there, whispering over my shoulder, I swear to God, I heard Sarah's voice, clear as day, said, "She stay." When I heard it, I froze, solid as a rock. Weird sounds came from the things. It was like the two were talking to each other. I heard sniffing. More strange noises, grunting and growling. Then one shrieked. Then the other. I didn't move a muscle. They were both right freaking next to me. I was holding my breath. Couldn't hold it much longer. They were going to see me. It was going to happen any second. Time stopped. I thought I was done for. I'd be joining Sarah and Max. And that thought, it filled me with joy. So much joy. But then, they ran off. I heard their footsteps fading away. Deeper and deeper into the woods. I was still holding my breath. A long moment went by. The wind rustled the leaves, but I didn't hear anything else. I opened my eyes. I realized how well I blended in. I was covered in thick mud. When I'd slid into this spot, the wet dirt and plants had just kind of molded to me. I quickly scrambled back to the hollow and climbed in, squeezing all the way inside. It was easy now, since I was so slimed up. I tried to get comfortable, which was pretty much impossible in the damp, peaty mess. I didn't sleep. My body was in a daze. My mind was racing. All I could think about was, why did I live? Did Sarah really speak to me? Or was it just my mind playing tricks? Why was I so alone? Left to miss them so much? Why couldn't I have just died and joined them? When the first light of dawn crept across the hollow, I peeked out. Birds were chirping. The forest looked beautiful, peaceful. I crawled out of the hollow, crouched down low, expecting the things to be there. But there was nothing. I knew there was a gas station I'd passed on the way in, south of my campsite. It was about 20 miles away, I figured, maybe less. I used the sun to navigate south and started walking. Every step I expected to be attacked. It took me 6 days. 6 days of eating berries and drinking creek water. 6 nights of sleeping in creepy, forest crawl spaces. I was sure a snake, a spider, or a bear would get me before dehydration or one of those things did. Somehow, I made it. I reached the highway, and eventually the gas station. My feet were destroyed. Blisters on top of blisters. Bruises on top of bruises. I think I might have broken some bones in my foot, maybe a couple of ribs too. My muscles were cramped and swollen. I was a total mess physically and emotionally. I was a lost man who, somehow, had decided to keep living. I told my story to 2 forest rangers. They listened patiently, probably thought I was a complete nut job. This crazy guy, covered in dried mud and berry stains, talking about spreading his family's ashes in the middle of nowhere. They wrote it all down and said, "We'll investigate and see what we find." I don't know if they believed me. I got the feeling one of them was holding something back. The other, older ranger seemed to be keeping her in check. I still had my phone, but it was totaled. I took it to a tech guy later, and he was able to access the hard drive, but there were no pictures. Nothing. The ranger followed up a few days later, said they found my campsite, my overturned car, and a bunch of empty liquor bottles. They didn't find any body or any traces of blood. He hinted that maybe I'd been really distraught, really drunk because of my loss, and maybe I'd driven drunk and flipped my own car, and that maybe I was a little delusional, maybe had a concussion. I didn't argue, didn't fight back. It did sound crazy. I didn't care if they believed me. I know what I saw, what I experienced. So, here I am, sitting in my crappy, empty apartment, listening to the city noise outside. I had to tell this story, share it with someone, because I'm lost. I don't know what to do next. The city sounds are a constant drone. Cars honking, sirens wailing in the distance, the muffled thumping of music from the apartment above. It's a stark contrast to the quiet of the woods. A quiet that was, ironically, far more terrifying. After the ranger's investigation, I felt even more adrift. I was in this weird limbo, alive but for what? I had no answers, just a whole lot of messed up memories and a body that ached in places I didn't know existed. I did go back to work. Surprise, surprise, I still had a job. My boss, a surprisingly decent guy, gave me a look when I walked in, a mix of pity and something else, maybe concern. He didn't ask too many questions, just told me to take it easy. I guess looking like I'd been mauled by a bear was explanation enough. My coworkers were a different story. Whispers followed me like a shadow. I caught snippets of conversations. "Did you hear? He looks awful. What do you think really happened?" I ignored them, mostly. What was the point? I tried to find solace in routine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. But the nights were the worst. The silence in my apartment was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to move. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, Sarah's voice echoing in my head. Stay. Why? Why stay? What was I staying for? I started going to a grief counselor, a woman named Dr. Evans. She had kind eyes and a soothing voice. I told her everything. About Sarah, about Max, about the woods, about the things. I even told her about hearing Sarah's voice. She listened patiently, nodding occasionally, taking notes. She didn't dismiss me, didn't call me crazy. She said grief can do strange things to the mind. That trauma can create vivid hallucinations, especially when combined with stress, exhaustion, and alcohol. She suggested that maybe, subconsciously, I wanted to join Sarah and Max. That maybe the things were a manifestation of my own self-destructive desires. And that Sarah's voice, that was my survival instinct. My subconscious telling me to hold on. It made sense. Sort of, but it didn't erase the images burned into my brain. The sheer terror. The absolute certainty that what I saw was real. One day, I got a call from Ben, my friend who moved across the country. He was coming back to town for a visit. We met up at a bar, a noisy, crowded place, the opposite of that silent forest. I told him the whole story. He listened, his eyes wide. He didn't laugh, didn't call me crazy. He just listened. "Dude," he said when I was finished, "that's insane. But I believe you. I don't know why, but I do." It was a small thing, but it meant the world to me. Just to have one person believe me without question. A few weeks later, I went back to the woods. I know, probably not the smartest move, but I had to. I had to see it again. I didn't go back to the exact spot. I couldn't. But I went close. I walked through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was peaceful, beautiful even. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, trying to make sense of it all. I still don't have any answers. I don't know if I ever will. Maybe Dr. Evans was right. Maybe it was all in my head. But there's a part of me, a deep, primal part, that knows it was real. I saw them. I heard them. I felt them. And I heard her. Sarah. I don't know what the future holds. I'm still lost, still adrift. But I'm here. I'm alive. I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to find my way back to something, to some kind of peace. The city noise still surrounds me, but sometimes when it's quiet, I can almost hear the whisper of the wind through the trees, and a voice, soft and distant, saying, "Stay." And for now, that's enough. For now, I'll stay. I'll keep going. For Sarah, for Max, for myself. Maybe there is a reason after all. Maybe I just haven't found it yet. Maybe that's what this is all about. Finding my way back to a life worth living, even in the echoes of the silence. Even with the lingering question of what lurks just beyond the edge of the light. "Dude, how much longer?" whined Billy, breaking the relative quiet that had descended upon our group. Honestly, I was getting pretty worn out myself. This whole camping trip in the Great Smokies had sounded like a blast when we first talked about it. Now, not so much. I mean, we'd been hiking for hours. "We're almost there, according to this," said Mark, holding up the map. "Oh, you mean that map that covers, like, the entire freaking state?" Sarah shot back. "Almost there could be another 100 miles. Mark spun around to glare at her. "You really think I'm that dumb? Of course, it's not a map of the whole state. I got this baby at the ranger station. It's just the Tennessee side of the Smokies, see?" He turned and stomped off, muttering under his breath. "Yeah, my bad, oh wise and powerful map master," Sarah mumbled, rolling her eyes. Mark stopped for a second, like he was going to say something, but then kept going. I knew he'd heard her. Normally, he would have ripped her a new one, but with everything that had happened, my thoughts were cut short by a loud hoof and some serious struggling sounds behind me. I turned to see poor Kevin wrestling with his backpack. It was wedged between two little trees, and he was stuck like a fly in a spider web. "Hang on, buddy," I said, trying to get down to him without getting my own pack snagged. Using the trees as handholds, I carefully made my way down and got his pack free. "Thanks, man," Kevin gasped, sweat dripping off him like he'd just run a marathon. This trip wasn't exactly a walk in the park to begin with. "Tell me about it," I said, panting a bit myself. "You need a breather." "Yeah," he said, practically collapsing onto the ground. I couldn't help but chuckle. Here was Kevin, the smallest guy in our group, looking like a dog on the hottest day of summer. "All right, hang tight. I'll be right back." I scrambled back up the hill, expecting to see the others waiting, but they were gone, not a trace. I started running along what I thought was the trail, but no luck. Finally, I stopped and yelled, "Mark, Sarah, Billy, where are you guys?" My voice echoed back to me, mocking me. No answering call, no sound of them pushing through the brush to get back to me. Nothing. It was like the whole forest had gone silent. Even the birds seemed to have taken a vow of silence. It was way quieter than it had been all day. Part of that was probably because Billy wasn't whining and Sarah and Mark weren't at each other's throats. Honestly, those two needed to either get a room or just admit they were crazy about each other. Maybe they knew, and this was just their version of foreplay. I don't know. Anyway, here I was, a city boy lost in the middle of nowhere. Mark had the map, and I hadn't learned a single thing about finding my way around or surviving in the wild. I just tagged along on this trip to hang out with my friends. A fun getaway in a cozy motel in Gatlinburg. Maybe catch some shows, do some shopping in Pigeon Forge. That's what I signed up for. It was Mark's bright idea to go on this ridiculous camping trip. Even though he said he got that map at the ranger station, I knew he probably hadn't listened to a word they said about which trail to take. Mark always had to be the leader. He probably just brushed them off, acting like he knew exactly where to go, even if he was clueless. Now I was starting to think maybe Sarah hadn't hooked up with him yet, because she was trying to bring him down a notch. Maybe she was waiting for him to be a little less full of himself. It had been 5 minutes since I last yelled, "Mark, Sarah, Billy," I shouted again, even louder this time. The only response was my own voice echoing back, louder than before. I glanced back the way we'd come, but I wasn't even sure which way that was. Mark had led us off the main trail a while back, and I had no clue where I'd left Kevin. The thick canopy of trees only let a little bit of sunlight through, but it was still high in the sky. At least I had daylight on my side for now. Turning back in the direction I hoped was right, I started back towards Kevin. If nothing else, at least there'd be two of us lost together instead of me being completely alone. It felt like it took forever to get back. I guess trying to catch up with people who actually know where they're going makes you walk a lot faster. It wasn't long before I realized I'd gone too far. I must have walked right past Kevin somehow. "Kevin, where are ya?" I yelled, once again hearing only the echo. Looking around, I was pretty sure this was where I'd left him. All the trees looked familiar, but then again, I had no idea how many millions of trees were in these mountains. There could be hundreds, even thousands of spots that looked exactly like this one. I started to seriously question the wisdom, or lack thereof, of only one person having a map. Then it hit me. I whipped out my phone and opened the Maps app. Surely, it could at least tell me where I was. My hopes were immediately crushed. No signal was staring back at me from the top of the screen. "Kevin," I yelled, louder this time, more out of frustration than anything else. I slumped to the ground, feeling more exhausted and hopeless than I had in a long time. And then I heard it. A faint call, carried on the wind. It sounded like it was miles away. "Kevin," I yelled again, my voice hoarse. I listened intently, which was easy since the animals still weren't making any noise. Again I heard the answering call. I jumped up like an excited puppy, took my best guess at the direction, and started marching with determination. I wouldn't call it a run, but it definitely wasn't a leisurely stroll. The thought of not being lost anymore, or at least not being lost alone, gave me a burst of energy. After a few minutes, I called out again and waited for a response. It came from the direction I was heading, but seemed even fainter, like he was moving away from me. That did it. I broke into a run, my heavy backpack flopping around wildly, almost making me trip. But I didn't care. I was getting closer, I could feel it. What I didn't feel was the tree roots sticking up just far enough to catch my toe and send me tumbling. I woke up to complete and utter darkness. Something big and heavy was pressing down on me, and I totally freaked out. I tried to shove it off, but it had me in a death grip. I thrashed around, punching and kicking, but this thing was strong. It was like it was glued to me, and it wasn't letting go. The weirdest part was how quiet it was. No growling, no snarling, nothing. Just this heavy weight holding me down like its life depended on it. Finally, I was just too exhausted to fight anymore. It had won. All I could do was lie there and wait for it to, I don't know, eat me or something. So I waited and waited. Nothing happened. Maybe whatever it was had fallen asleep. But how could it sleep through all my thrashing? I had no idea. My shoulder was atching from the struggle, and I started rubbing it. As I did, my fingers brushed against the thing that was holding me down. Curiosity, or maybe just plain stupidity, made me reach out and feel it again. And then it hit me. It was my backpack. My head thumped against the ground as I realized how dumb I was. Slowly, I unbuckled the straps and pulled my arms free. It felt amazing to roll that heavy thing off me. I lay there for a minute, catching my breath, and that's when I remembered how dark it was. I mean, pitch black. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and turned on the flashlight. As I did, I saw the "no signal" message still taunting me from the top of the screen. I wondered if I'd get any signal at all before I got out of this cursed place. I shone the light around, trying to figure out what had happened. I was in some kind of ditch. A rock in the ditch had a small, dark red patch on it. I reached up and felt a tender spot on my head. "That'll do it," I muttered, realizing I must have hit my head when I fell. Checking myself over with the flashlight, I was relieved to find no other injuries, just the minor problem of being lost and alone in the middle of the woods. At least the animals were making noise again. That was kind of comforting in a weird way. With the self-assessment done, I shone the light around the area, trying to get my bearings. The answer was simple and frustrating. I was in the middle of the woods, surrounded by trees. Big surprise. Sighing, I dug through my backpack and found some granola bars and a couple of bottles of water. My stomach growled like a monster. I ripped open a granola bar and wolfed it down. 3 bars and a whole bottle of water later, I felt a little more human. As I was enjoying my little feast, the animal noises suddenly stopped. The silence sent chills down my spine. It was so sudden and complete. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Swallowing the last gulp of water was so loud, it almost made me jump. My flashlight beam was drifting aimlessly when, suddenly, I saw them, a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness just inside the tree line. They had a creepy yellow glow. I tried to remember if that meant it was a predator, but then it hit me. The silence was already telling me it was a predator. This thing, whatever it was, didn't seem to have any fur. Its gray skin made it look like no animal I'd ever seen. It reminded me of Gollum from Lord of the Rings, all hunched over on all fours. But its front legs looked more like arms. If I didn't know better, I would have thought it was a lost kid. But this was no innocent child. It crept towards me with a slow, deliberate movement that screamed, "Hunter." There was nothing helpless about this creature. I unzipped my pack and started rummaging through it, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was getting closer, and I knew I was running out of time. "Come on, come on," I muttered, frantically moving things around in my backpack. I knew it was in here somewhere. It was getting dangerously close now. One good leap, and it would be on me. I went for broke and dumped the entire contents of my backpack onto the ground. I heard a loud thud as something metallic hit the dirt. I swung my flashlight around and found what I was looking for: my Glock. I grabbed it and pointed it in the direction where the creature had been, fully expecting it to be right in my face. But it was gone. I whipped around, scanning the trees with my flashlight, gun ready, desperately searching for any sign of the creature before it was too late. After a quick scan, I slowly panned around in a full circle, searching more carefully. Nothing. I wanted to let out a sigh of relief, but I knew it could be hiding behind any one of those trees. I started picking up my stuff and shoving it back into my backpack. As I did, the animal noises started up again. It was a small comfort, thinking that thing had left, but I didn't trust it one bit. Once my backpack was repacked, I sat down and leaned against it like a pillow, my back to the edge of the ditch, my phone's flashlight shining out towards the trees. My gun rested on my lap, ready for action. It wasn't long before my eyelids started feeling heavy. I jerked myself awake, only to have my eyes start closing again a few moments later. It was a constant battle, harder than trying to stay awake in church. My phone told me it was after 4 in the morning. The sun would be up in a couple of hours. Then, maybe, I could actually try to find my friends. My phone also told me it only had 20, 3% battery left. I had a major debate with myself. Keep the flashlight on and risk losing the ability to use my phone if I ever got a signal. Or turn off the light, save the battery, but leave myself vulnerable to that thing. It was a tough call until I remembered the animals. They were making noise now, but they'd gone silent when that creature was around. My only question was, did they only shut up for that specific creature, or for any big predator? I honestly couldn't remember. I took one last look around before powering off my phone. Leaning against my backpack, the fight to stay awake continued. Each time I snapped my eyes open, the sky was a little bit lighter. Soon, I could make out the faint outlines of the trees looming over me. Not creepy at all. Finally, I lost the battle and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up to something rough and wet on my face. My eyes flew open, and I saw a freaking deer, licking my cheek. I nearly had a heart attack. I jumped back, slipping off my backpack and falling against the dirt wall of the ditch. The deer freaked out too, leaping away and disappearing into the forest like it was being chased by a pack of wolves. Once my heart rate returned to something resembling normal, I looked around. It was late morning, and the forest was bathed in sunlight. And I was still alive. That creature hadn't come back to kill me in my sleep. I took that as a good sign. I stood up and stretched, trying to figure out my next move. Shouting was out of the question. I was pretty sure that creature would see it as an open invitation to dinner. But how was I supposed to figure out which way I was going before I took that tumble? As I was standing there, looking back at the faint trail, I saw the root sticking up that had caused this whole mess. Okay, I thought. I drew an imaginary line from where I was standing to the root. Then I followed that line past me, towards the direction I'd been heading before the fall. Looking up at the mountain towering above the trees, I searched for a landmark. There was this huge rock jutting out from the mountainside, with no trees around it. That was it. That was my new North Star. Speaking of direction, I glanced to my right and saw the sun, already high in the late morning sky, with the sun in the east. I turned back towards my rock and figured it was roughly north. All right, I had a plan, or at least a direction. I started walking, trying to keep that rock in sight. It was a no-brainer that my friends were probably worried sick. They were probably back at the motel, calling everyone they knew, organizing a search party. I chuckled darkly at that thought. I knew they were just as lost as I was in these woods. Mark pretended to know what he was doing, but truth be told, he was probably the most clueless of us all, mostly because he was too stubborn to listen to anyone else. What if they ran into that creature? The thought stopped me dead in my tracks. That thing looked like it wanted to eat me for dinner. Running into the four of them would be like stumbling upon an all. You can eat Buffett. I shook my head, trying to clear the image. There was nothing I could do about it now, anyway. But my earlier optimism about finding my way was gone, replaced by a heavy dose of worry for my friends. As I walked, my thoughts drifted to each of them. Mike, so excited about finally seeing the Dixie Stampede. Sarah and Mark, and what a train wreck of a couple they'd be, always fighting, even now when they were just friends. Or were they? I'd caught them exchanging these little glances when we were all together. Could the whole fighting thing be an act? Were they already a couple, trying to keep it a secret? And then there was Billy. Honestly, I had no idea why I was even friends with Billy. He was one of those guys who just started tagging along one day, and before you knew it, he was part of the group. Billy was always trying to compete with Mark for the leadership role, but he went about it in a different way. He'd whine and complain until he got his way. Not always, but definitely when it was something he felt strongly about. Billy hadn't wanted to come on this trip in the first place, and honestly, I think we all would have been happier if he'd stayed home. Being alone with my thoughts, I was actually making good time. The forest wasn't as dense here, and it was a slight downhill slope, easy walking. In fact, I almost started whistling. I quickly squashed that idea. No need to make any extra noise for that creature to track. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, just to make sure nothing was following me. Each time I looked back, the sky behind me seemed to be getting darker. The sun soon disappeared completely, and I couldn't deny it anymore. A storm was rolling in. Great, just what I needed. There was no shelter around here, except for the trees, and they weren't exactly waterproof. Even though I knew I was going to get soaked, I picked up my pace. Maybe I could find a rock overhang or something to hide under. As I hurried along, there was this blinding flash, followed by a deafening boom that knocked me off my feet. At first, I thought a bomb had gone off. I looked around and saw a tree on the mountainside, split in half and on fire. It looked like some giant had just ripped it apart. I was still staring at it, trying to figure out what the heck was happening, when another flash lit up the clouds. This time the thunder was a little farther away, but it still shook the ground. Okay, time to find some shelter, and fast, before Mother Nature decided to use me as target practice. I started running towards the mountain as huge raindrops started pelting my back. It felt like I was getting hit with mini water balloons. It didn't take long for the rain to really pick up. It was coming down in sheets, a total downpour. The ground was turning into a muddy mess. Since I wasn't on the trail anymore, I was stumbling through puddles and little bogs, struggling to stay upright as the mud tried to suck me down. I held my hand above my eyes, trying to see where I was going, but the rain was just too thick. Visibility was zero, but I kept pushing forward, hoping to find some kind of shelter. Suddenly, I ran smack into something hard. It was the base of the mountain. I kept one hand on the rock face to guide me as I walked sideways along the mountain. Then, suddenly, my hand was grasping at air. I hadn't realized how much I'd been leaning on that rock until it wasn't there anymore. I fell forward onto surprisingly dry ground. Rolling over and looking up, I realized I was at the mouth of a cave. I sat up and enjoyed the feeling of being out of the rain, watching the downpour just outside, like a curtain of water. After resting for a few minutes, I started rubbing my arms, trying to get warm. I took off my backpack and dug through it, hoping to find something useful. Luckily, I'd packed a sweatshirt. I took off my soaked t-shirt, used it as a makeshift towel, and pulled on the warm, relatively dry sweatshirt. While I was looking, I found another granola bar and scarfed it down, then finished off my last bottle of water. Staring at the empty bottle, I had an idea. I held it out into one of the streams of water pouring off the cave entrance until it was full. I put the cap on, noticing the water wasn't exactly crystal clear, but I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally, and I might need it later. I set my backpack down, leaning it against the side of the cave entrance, then pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight again. The beam only went so far into the darkness. Even the fading daylight from outside couldn't penetrate very deep. It was like a wall of shadows, just a big black hole. I took a few steps into the cave, just to check it out. I was about to turn back and wait out the storm by the entrance when I smelled something. It was faint at first, and I had to take a few more steps before I was sure. My mind must be playing tricks on me, because I swore I smelled barbecue. My curiosity and my growling stomach got the better of me. I started walking deeper into the cave, the flashlight beam illuminating my way. The smell of cooked meat was getting stronger, and it smelled amazing. It wasn't long before I saw a faint glow ahead, a fire, burning somewhere in the depths of the cave, casting an orange light on the walls. The promise of warmth and maybe even food was pulling me in. But then, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Movement that made my blood run cold. Coming from the far side of the fire was that creature. The same one that had stalked me last night, or at least it looked the same. The yellow eyes glowing in the firelight, the hunched over posture, walking on all fours like some kind of twisted golem. I quickly turned off my flashlight and threw myself behind a large rock, hoping it was big enough to hide me. Straight ahead, I could see the pinprick of light that was the cave entrance. Even if I wanted to make a run for it, that creature would see me for sure. I risked a peek around the rock, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw made my stomach churn. The creature was tending to the fire, totally oblivious to me. It was checking on pieces of meat that were laid out on hot rocks next to the fire. It took a few pieces off and set them aside. Then it walked towards the left wall and disappeared. I leaned out a little further, trying to see what it was doing, and immediately wished I hadn't. Hanging from a large wooden frame, tied up spread eagle, was a human male, and he had been skinned. The creature came up to him and started carving off chunks of muscle with a crude, but very large-looking knife. Once it had a few pieces, it took them back to the fire and laid them on the hot rocks where the other meat had been. Then it grabbed the cooked pieces and disappeared into a hole in the wall. I scrambled back behind the rock, breathing hard, the horrifying realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. "Oh my God," I whispered. "That thing killed someone, and it's eating him." My stomach lurched. I fought back the urge to vomit, knowing how loud I could be when I puked. And I definitely didn't want that thing to know I was here. I peeked around the corner again. The creature was gone. My eyes were drawn to the body hanging there. And that's when I saw him. There was another body strung up next to him. Another naked male, but this one hadn't been skinned yet. Two more bodies hung beside that one. One male, one female, both naked as well. Recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. The naked woman was Sarah, and the men, they were Billy and Mike. No, 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 I said, any pretense of being quiet gone. I rushed over to them, tears streaming down my face. Their eyes were closed. None of them were moving. I went to them one by one, desperately feeling for a pulse. The one who had been skinned, I assumed it was Mark. He had no pulse. Then Mike. There was a gash on his neck, dried blood all down his front. No pulse. Billy was the same. Gash on his neck, no pulse. When I got to Sarah, I noticed something. Her chest, it was moving, and she didn't have a gash on her neck. I reached up to check her pulse, and her eyes snapped open. She started screaming. I clamped my hand over her mouth, but I knew it was too late. You need to be quiet and pretend you're dead, or I will be, you understand. I hissed, still holding her mouth. She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. I ran around behind them, just as I heard footsteps approaching. I stood behind Mark's body, since he was the biggest, and put my hands and feet behind his, mimicking the spread eagle position. My only hope was that it wouldn't notice me. I didn't dare move as I heard the footsteps enter the area and come closer. I stood as still as a statue, hardly breathing. Only my eyes moved, glancing over at Sarah. The creature was standing in front of her now, looking her over. She had lowered her head again, trying to look dead or asleep. The creature poked her in the chest with the knife, drawing a few drops of blood, but she didn't even flinch. And then another creature stepped up beside the first one, and then a third. They poked and prodded Sarah, trying to get a reaction, but she stayed perfectly still. Panic swelled inside me. How many of these things were there? If it was just one, I would have shot it already. But if there were dozens of them hiding in the darkness, I was done for. My thoughts were interrupted by sounds coming from the creatures. It was like insects chittering, communicating with each other. They seemed to be arguing, still standing in front of Sarah, who, incredibly, hadn't moved a muscle. As their argument got more heated, I noticed one of the creatures looking in my direction. The longer I watched, the more I realized it wasn't just looking in my direction, it was looking right at me. It stepped around Sarah to the back, and its eyes widened. It started screeching, pointing at me. The other two looked from the first creature to where it was pointing, and then they saw me. Their eyes narrowed. One of them stepped in front of Mark's body. Another moved between Billy and Mike. The one with the knife was closest when I gave up all pretense of hiding. I pulled out my gun and shot all three of them. The sound of the gunshots in the enclosed space of the cave was deafening. My ears were ringing so badly, I couldn't hear anything else. I grabbed the knife from the ground and quickly cut Sarah down. She collapsed into a heap on the floor, weak and disoriented. We should go, I tried to say, but it was no use. I was temporarily deaf. What? She yelled, also clearly unable to hear. We should, I started, then gave up. I bent down and hoisted her over my shoulder in a fireman's carry. It was a struggle, carrying her and trying to hold on to the gun at the same time. She kept slipping, and I had to keep grabbing her to keep her on my shoulder. Thing was, I was grabbing her bare butt every time. It wasn't like I had a choice or was enjoying it. I just didn't want her to fall off. As I started running, My legs already shaking from the exertion, a rock whizzed past my cheek. I glanced back and saw more of those creatures, a whole bunch of them, pouring out of the side passages of the cave, chasing after us. I didn't have time to stop and aim, but I pointed the gun in the direction of the closest one and fired. By some miracle, the creature stumbled and fell. I didn't know if I'd actually hit it or if the sound of the gun had just scared it, but it was down. I didn't have a chance to celebrate, though. Another rock hit me, this time in the back of the head. It nearly made me fall, which would have been a death sentence. Instead, I pointed and fired again, and this time I heard a satisfying scream. The cave mouth was getting closer, the light growing brighter. Then, suddenly, we were out, back in the storm. But it wasn't over. I looked back and saw a horde of those creatures spilling out of the cave, still chasing us. We were so close, but my legs were about to give out. Carrying Sarah was taking its toll. I needed a break, and I needed it now. I didn't think those things would understand if I called a timeout, though. Another rock hit me, this time in the back, as if to emphasize that point. I pointed and fired again, but this time, no scream. Finally, my legs gave out. I tripped and Sarah, and I went tumbling to the ground in a tangled mess. Somehow, I managed to hold on to the gun. I tried to get up, but I stumbled to the side, still aiming and firing at another creature. They were trying to surround us, but I shot two more. Scrambling to my feet, I was able to aim better and shot another. But there were still so many of them, way too many to count. I started aiming at groups of them, hoping to take down more than one at a time. They kept trying to flank us, and I kept shooting them as they did. But then the inevitable happened. The slide on my gun locked back, empty. I immediately released it, hoping maybe they didn't know what that meant. I kept aiming the gun at them, trying to look threatening. They held their distance, not wanting to be the next one shot, but they had us surrounded, and they were closing in. I looked at Sarah, ready to say goodbye, but she wasn't looking at me. She had my phone, and she was frantically doing something with it. I hoped she was calling for help, even though I knew no one could get here in time to save us. Staring into the nightmare faces of those bloodthirsty cannibals, I started to pray. A desperate, last-ditch effort kind of prayer. The first creature was within reach when suddenly, the most piercing, ear-splitting sound filled the air. It was coming from behind me. I looked back and saw Sarah holding my phone up with one hand, the other hand clamped over her ear. I covered my own ears, too. The sound was agonizing. The creatures screamed in pain, trying to cover their ears, but it was no use. As a group, they turned and fled back into the cave, holding their ears as they went. I couldn't believe it. I turned to Sarah as she shut off the alarm. A huge grin spread across my face. "Well, aren't you clever?" I said, my voice hoarse. "Not clever enough," she said, looking down at her naked body. "You think I could borrow your sweatshirt?" I chuckled and took off the sweatshirt, handing it to her. "We should find a road and get out of here before they decide to come back," I said. As we walked, she explained what had happened, how the creatures had surrounded them, how they'd assumed Mike and I were already captured. "The funny thing was," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark never gave up hope. He kept telling us to hold on, that you would find us. Even when... Don't tell me, I said. He was still alive when they... She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. I can still hear his screams, she said, a haunted look in her eyes. I don't think I'll ever forget that. I can't imagine, I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. But even after they took his face, he still told us not to give up hope. Amazing, I whispered, shaking my head. After walking for what felt like an eternity, constantly looking over our shoulders, we finally saw it, a road. The most beautiful sight either of us had ever seen. Within an hour, a ranger found us. It was the longest hour of our lives, waiting, terrified that those creatures would come back and drag us back to that cave. Our friends were never found. The ranger told us we were lucky to be alive. He said a lot of hikers go missing in these mountains, never to be seen again. I know Sarah and I never want to see another forest again, unless maybe we're driving past it on the highway, far, far away. My name's Sam, and let me tell you, I'm about as grounded in reality as you can get. Ghosts, goblins, Bigfoot. None of that stuff ever fazed me. People want to believe that's cool, more power to them. But me, I've always seen the world as just stuff happening. Things moving, colliding, and eventually, your own personal motion just stops. But my buddy Ethan, I think he's still up there somewhere, moving around. Maybe he's lost his marbles after all this time. Hell if I know. I was super on the edge about even writing all this down, but what else am I gonna do? So, let's rewind. I won't give you all the nitty-gritty details for privacy reasons, but I'm from the Northwest, born and raised, after my family moved us from New Mexico when I was like 5. Best thing that ever happened to me, honestly. This is where I fell in love with the outdoors, hiking, hunting, fishing, all that good stuff. Back in New Mexico, not so much, but here, towering trees, rivers carving their way through these gnarly-ass rocks. I love it up here. Even school wasn't half bad. You know, the usual high school BS ex-girlfriends, jerks, the occasional fistfight, teen drama. But overall, my life was pretty chill. Pretty much a one-note song. Until Ethan disappeared. It was 10 years ago. Sophomore year. Our whole class went on this field trip to a mountain range nearby. This place was like hiker heaven. Beautiful views, lots of open areas so you wouldn't get super lost. They even had this trail that went up to some old pioneer's cabin. Cute little spot. I went back there a few times in later years. So, Ethan, my best friend since junior year. We clicked mostly 'cause we were into the same kind of music, alternative rock, mostly. And yeah, to all you metalheads out there, I did get into Tool and some Machine Head. I experimented, okay. But alt-rock was our bread and butter. Honestly, music was what held us together. We'd talk for hours about our favorite bands, argue like crazy over which albums sucked. We even talked about starting our own band, but Valley Boys was never meant to be, I guess. I remember that day so damn clearly. Not just the main event, but all the little stuff leading up to it. It's been years, and it still hasn't left me. How could it? On the bus ride over, We were going back and forth about My Chemical Romance's new compilation album, May Death Never Stop You. We both agreed that we were hoping for a whole new album, not just a rehash of old hits. I mean, yeah, I dig their sound, Ethan said, but it's time to shake things up a bit. Dude, I argued, if you had a cash cow like that, why would you mess with it? He thought about it for a second, the bus bouncing us around. Because I have some self-respect, he finally said. Yeah, well, you'll have self-respect in a cardboard box, I chuckled. He tried to hide a smile, but it was creeping onto his face. So, Captain Shameless, he said, changing the subject, have you talked to Maya yet? Oof. Sore subject. Okay, I still have issues, but back then, I was terrified of girls. I'd get close, and it was like my brain turned to mush. Sweating, stammering, the whole 9 yards. Ethan, on the other hand, he was smooth. Or at least that's what I thought in high school. Looking back, he probably just figured out that confidence was key a lot sooner than the rest of us. I'm gonna do it on this trip, I declared way too confidently, blowing my long brown hair out of my eyes. Oh, she's right over there, he said, nodding towards the seat behind us, where 2 guys were sitting. I think his game was to embarrass me. Jerk, I muttered, smacking him with my red baseball cap. I looked down and noticed Ethan was wearing a Metallica shirt. Weird, since that wasn't really his usual style, but I gotta admit, it fit his look, shaggy black hair, brown eyes, tall. Traitor, I thought jokingly. He looked down at his shirt, then back at me, and smirked. Dude, chill, Sam. I just think the album cover is cool. We settled back into our usual banter, but I could tell something was bugging him. I should have asked him. God, I should have just asked him. Ethan wasn't the type to get distracted. He lived in the moment, I lived in my head. That's how we rolled. But something was off that day. What was he thinking about? For the love of God, what was going through his head? The bus rumbled through this little valley town, climbing higher and higher to our destination. Miles and miles of fields. I remember thinking I wouldn't mind living out there. But then, how could I be a rock star and a mountain man? Those 2 things didn't exactly go hand in hand. People like to put things in neat little boxes. Everything has to make sense, right? You start mixing things up, people get confused. And when they're confused, they feel dumb. Nobody likes feeling dumb. So, people will just empty themselves out, just to stuff themselves with something more organized. Nobody except Ethan knew I hunted, that I loved camping on weekends. Nature was my escape. Music was the art I listened to away from the noise of cities and buildings. Finally, the bus pulled into this little dirt parking lot, all signs and boulders marking the start of the trail. I was trying to keep up appearances with my pearl-jammed shirt and ripped jeans, but I wasn't stupid enough to wear sneakers on a 2-hour hike. I made sure Ethan didn't make that mistake, either. He tied his boots like bunny ears instead of cross-hatching, which, I gotta say, annoyed the hell out of me. I looked out at the woods. More brown than green, really. Dry dirt leading up to bark that twisted the trees into these weird shapes. I could almost see animals and faces in the bark. Those woods were like a siren calling you in. Kids started piling out, laughing and joking around. I saw a whole lot of sneakers. Our teacher, Mr. Donaldson, everyone called him Mr. D, was this old guy who always sounded like he was gargling gravel. Our ancient protector rasped out, "All right, everyone, we're hiking Truck Trail." Well, like we couldn't see the giant sign right in front of us. Naturally, being the closet hiker that I was, I'd already done my homework on this trail, and I knew right away that this whole thing was a bad idea. Every source I could find called it a severe hike. Almost 20 kilometers total. Obviously, Mr. D wasn't planning on taking us the whole way, but even a quarter of that was way too much for a bunch of sophomores. I joked with Ethan that all those pretty sneakers were gonna be covered in puke by the end. He didn't laugh, just stared at the trail, kind of wistfully. I brushed off his silence and scanned the parking lot. A few other cars were there, a beat-up old red Chevy, a gray Tundra, and a yellow Corvette that had seen better days. Me, in my infinite paranoia, started wondering what kind of people would be hiking this severe trail. And so, we started our climb. I remember the sun was a real bastard that day. Hot as hell. I'd brought a big jug of water, thank God. The trail just radiated heat. We were basically walking through the crack between two mountains, trees starting to crowd in closer, like they were trying to swallow us whole. I don't know if it's just because of what happened, or if I really felt it at the time, but the whole place felt wrong, like I was a wounded animal going off to die alone somewhere. I passed the water jug to Ethan, making sure he took a good swig. I looked up and saw Maya a little ways behind us. "All right, Romeo, now's your chance." Ethan nudged me. "You got a sweat stain on your butt." And Ethan spun around, and before he realized I was messing with him, I stumbled towards Maya. "Hey, are you okay?" She asked. "Yeah. So, sweaty out here, right?" "What? The sun? It's, sunny." "Yeah." I practically ran back to Ethan before I could embarrass myself any further. I was shaking, my whole body trembling like I was about to get my ass kicked. "What happened?" he asked. He knew from the look on my face to just drop it, to let that whole train wreck of an interaction just fade away in the heat. Ethan started tapping his leg, staring out at this outcropping we'd come to. Steep hills on either side, mostly bare. We passed this huge boulder, and that's when I noticed Ethan's tapping had become non-stop. "Working on a new song?" I asked. He looked over and gave me a weak smile. "It's been coming together." "Any actual guitar playing this time?" I teased. "I've been thinking piano, actually." "Seriously, Wes, Sam, a piano. Pianos have a lot of range." "Yeah, a range that'll keep you miles away from any girls." He laughed at that, and a few people turned around to look. I probably would have been embarrassed if my head wasn't so full of the damn heat. Sweat was dripping into my eyes as we walked through another patch of trees. We'd been hiking for about an hour when one of the girls started swaying. One of her friends caught her, and I looked around, realizing there was no one to tell. Mr. D was gone. I figured he'd fallen behind. Some of the older kids suggested we head back down to find him, and if we couldn't, we'd tell the bus driver. An actual plan I could get behind. Smart kids. So, we started this awkward, sweaty descent. A few other kids started getting nauseous. I didn't blame them. It was way too hot for a hike like this. I had no idea what Mr. D was thinking, bringing us out here. Ethan seemed especially bothered. I checked on him. "Hey, man, you want some water? You can have the last of it." I sloshed the water around to really sell it. I can't hear very well," he mumbled. I'd never heard of that being a symptom of heat stroke. Maybe confusion. I told him we were about halfway down. Maya apparently heard me. "How do you know that, Sam?" she asked, a little annoyed. "Heat will do that to you." "Oh, I just remember this bend comes after that boulder we passed, which was about halfway up." "Damn, you have a good sense of direction," she said. I blushed and, like an idiot, said, "I have hiking boots." "What?" she asked. Yeah, the confusion wasn't heat stroke. Ethan turned around. I see that face sometimes when I'm spacing out. Sometimes when that personality that had been so key to a younger me comes floating back into my head, I see his face, aghast, like he'd just realized something awful. It makes me sick now just thinking about what he said. Just typing it out makes it too real. Something happened to Mr. D, he stated flat out. I was completely thrown. What a weird thing to say. Like he'd been given some kind of information the rest of us didn't have. It was just alien. "What?" I stammered. He shook his head, like he was trying to clear the cobwebs from his heat-addled brain. Nobody else heard him, thank God. Right now, I'm thinking, why the fuck did he bring us out there that day? That goddamn idiot. Even typing it gets me so pissed. He should be held responsible. He should have been held more responsible, is what I should be saying. Maybe I'd still be joking around with Ethan about musical instruments today, but not today, or yesterday, not for a long time. "This heat is bad, Sam, you don't understand," he said, waving me off like he was trying to shoo away a ghost. I pressed him to tell me what he meant. That's when the girl passed out. She just crumpled to the ground. Panic started to set in. A bunch of sophomores on a scorching mountain, losing their shit. Those older kids rushed over to her, checking her pulse, opening her eyelids. I just stood there for a second, frozen, watching it all happen. I told myself what every guy tells himself in a situation like that. They've got enough people. They don't need me. Classic guy move, right? They picked her up, and I turned to Ethan, about to ask him if we should do something, and he was gone, like smoke. 1 second he was there, right next to me. The next, he wasn't. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't said a word. One moment he existed, and the next, the world just swallowed him whole. The forest was so quiet. I remember everyone just faded into the background. It's like having someone attached to your hip, and then suddenly, they're just gone. How do you even describe that? Even now, after therapy, after all the soul-searching, some things just can't be put into words. Only feelings. Someone was in my life. Then they weren't. All in the span of like 10 seconds, I should have just kept looking at him. He couldn't have run off. Anyway, all I could think at the time was, where is he going? Stupidly, that naive thought stuck with me for the next hour down the trail. And the next, all the way to the bus stop. Oh, he's probably just taking a piss up there. He'll be down. Oh, he must be lost. We'll find him. He probably bedded down for the night. The rangers will get him. Then he'll come down. My friend is alive. I know it. Even days later, I was still holding on to that hope. When we got to the bus stop, Mr. D was there, being looked after by the bus driver. I asked if they'd seen Ethan. No answer. I asked if they'd go back up and help look. The bus driver said he couldn't leave everyone unattended. "Can I go?" I pleaded. "No, we don't need anyone else unaccounted for." We waited for an hour before they finally called the rangers. There was nothing we could do. Mr. D was rambling, in no shape to go anywhere. He looked sick, and not just from the heat. As the sun dipped behind the mountains and the bus headlights clicked on, I saw the lights of the rangers' ATVs snaking their way up the trail. It gave me this feeling of what I can only call uniformity failure. I watched them, and maybe, deep down, I knew they weren't going to find him. That they were being careful instead of fast. That they were planning instead of doing. Maybe that's why I snapped at Mr. D on WITHEFUKDIDURBNBF I screamed. Everyone jumped. I wasn't exactly the outspoken type, for reasons I think are pretty clear by now. Mr. D just stared at me, speechless, until he finally croaked out, "Thank you." I tensed up, every muscle in my body coiled tight with anger. Slowly, it drained away, leaving behind this puddle of simmering resentment. I stormed off towards the road and started pacing. It was all so surreal. What was I supposed to do next? Go home. To a place without someone I'd known since 8th grade. Who was gonna push me out of my comfort zone? Who was I gonna laugh with? I was completely exhausted from that hellish hike. I kept wondering what was taking him so long. How could I accept that he was just missing? But I did, because I was 15 and afraid to keep him alive in my memory. Without Ethan, I dove headfirst into my hiking, spent most of my time alone. I wasn't friendless, but no best friends, you know. Got to know the fish and game guys pretty well. Even some of the local rangers knew me, so it made sense when I eventually became a guide. Mostly for other hunters, but sometimes for families who wanted to see the sights. I actually opened up a lot more when I was out in nature, so talking got easier. Something about being responsible for other people made me feel like I had to get to know them. Most of them, I was glad I did. The pay's not great, but the job is. So that's what I've been doing for the past 3 years or so. I make it a point to explore new trails. 1, because it can bring in new clients, and 2, well, I love hiking. I think I've made that pretty clear. But there was one trail I avoided like the plague, no matter how close it was to the trails I knew like the back of my hand. Trail still haunted me. Every now and then, I'd have this dream about Ethan, just standing there on that trail looking at me, saying nothing. So, yeah, I steered clear of that place. Life went on as it tends to do, until my girlfriend, Sarah, told me I needed some exposure therapy, and I gotta admit, she might have been right. I'm a big believer in facing your fears and all that, so the fact that I let that trail mess with me for so long just shows how freaked out I really was. So, I finally decided to do it. Sarah offered to come with me, but I told her I didn't want her to see me cry. Played it off as a joke, but who knew how I'd react up there. I drove my 2015 Wrangler up, crested over that hill, and rolled down into that sunny little valley town I hadn't seen in years. People were just as nice as I remembered, waving me through like I was one of their own. I slowed down as I got closer to the trailhead. I stopped the Jeep at the entrance to the parking lot, and my hands started shaking. I hadn't seen anyone die. I hadn't been attacked. So why was I shaking like a leaf? It made me so mad I floored it and lurched into the parking lot with a jolt. I threw the car into park and slapped myself hard across the face. Easiest hike of my life, I muttered, meeting my own gaze in the rearview mirror. I turned on the radio, tuning into the weather band. Didn't hear anything, so I checked my little notepad where I'd written down the forecast for the day. I'll just write it out here, since I still have it. Yopim arrive at 2 p.m.s and 7:55. Their winds 3 3 m's and 80 f. No notable changes. At 4 p.m.s 82% chance of rain. At 5 p.m. 3% of rain. Head back. I checked my watch to it was working right to make sure if I've chancer in right. Then I double checked my backpack. All the essentials were there: map, PLB, water, MRE, hunting knife, metal bowl, fire starter, binoculars, and some snacks. Thorough, that's my motto. Oh, and my Kimber Cane 6S, can't forget that. I ran a hand through my short brown hair, stretched my shoulders. All the hunting and hiking had made my already stocky build a little bit stronger. But all the snacks had balanced it out with a bit of a gut. I took a few steps towards the trail marker, and that feeling of dread just washed over me. There was only one other vehicle in the lot, an old red Chevy. My hand instinctively went to my holster, just for a little sense of security. I swallowed hard and started walking. My new hiking boots were comfortable, at least. This hike would decide if they were my lucky boots or my shit boots. As I made my way up, this creeping feeling of fear started crawling up my legs. I stomped harder, trying to shake it off, to shake off the weakness spreading through my limbs. I forced myself to keep going. I couldn't let that trail win. I had to be stronger than that. Soon the wind picked up a little. I checked my watch, 2:05 p.m. I nodded to myself, right on schedule. I came to an outcropping and sat down on a tree stump, looking out over the valley below. A creek was way down there, a ribbon of silver in the sunlight. My eyes lingered, and I made out a figure crouched down at the edge of it. I grabbed my binoculars out of my bag and focused. It was a guy, all decked out in fishing gear, looking pretty rough around the edges. Definitely a bushman. Looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. He was casting a net into the creek, which I knew was illegal as hell, but confronting a poacher out in the middle of nowhere. That's how people go missing. So I kept my mouth shut. I stood up, taking one last look at the guy with the huge, bushy beard. Damn, I thought. He actually caught a fish. It flopped onto the bank, and the guy just stood on it. I expected him to just step on its head, kill it quick. But no. He took out his knife and started cutting off its tail. I groaned as he started cutting it from back to front. The fish, still gasping, still alive. He'd just stand there, watching it. He'd make a cut, then watch it twitch, until the thing finally gave up the ghost. Then, calm as you please, he washed his hands off and cast his net back out. All the fish parts just lying there on the bank, cooking in the sun. I left that spot, deciding that this trail was just cursed with weird shit. It honestly shook me. I started wondering if this was one of those creepy ass towns where everyone's in on some secret that nobody else understands. I loved those movies. Clouds started rolling in, blocking out the sun, and suddenly I was in the shade. Not that I was complaining. Well, maybe a little, since it was only supposed to be a 5-10% chance of rain. That's when I passed that big boulder, the one that marked the halfway point to where I'd last seen Ethan. It wasn't just a marker anymore. It was like a tombstone or something. I rubbed my hand over my face, and when I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan in the darkness. I opened them, quickly slapping myself again, over and over. I practically ran up the rest of the trail, letting my irritation fuel me. I took out my water and looked down at it. The life of my body, contained in a little metal cylinder. I drank. I kept going, replaying everything I told you earlier. The past, that moment, stuck in my head. Mr. D is in trouble. I mumbled to myself. I looked up, and the path ahead was one I hadn't taken before. I looked back, and there were those quiet trees, the ones Ethan had supposedly vanished into. My skin tightened like a drum. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I froze. Going any further up that mountain felt like suicide. Every inch of me was screaming at me to turn back. It's hard to even put this into words. It feels like I'm back there again, and I don't want to be back there. I looked up the hill, then back down. A figure with long, black hair and a band T-shirt had its back to me, walking back into the trees. It was so casual, so quick. I clutched my chest, my heart hammering away in my chest like a drum. "Hello." I called out, not really knowing what else to say. I started walking back down, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Real footprints. I followed them, my mind racing. Did he run away? Has he been lost this whole time? Am I hallucinating? Is it just some random person? I ran after the footprints. They disappeared into the trees. I burst through, stopping just short of a steep drop-off. I shook my head, realizing that the trail was obviously lost. "Eteen, we are REO." I yelled, my voice echoing through the empty valley. All I got back was silence, and that silence was filled with a heavy dose of hopelessness. It sounds stupid, I know. It could have been anyone, but I can't shake the feeling that it was him. Even the way he walked was so familiar. Everything about it. I couldn't bring myself to climb any higher, so I started back down. I felt this weird, primal sickness, like my ancestors were warning me about a predator nearby. My skin was crawling, and my senses were on high alert. And then I heard it. Someone was out of breath. I looked back up the trail. The breathing got steadier when I stopped. My hand went to my holster. "Hey, show yourself," I yelled, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The breathing turned into this raspy sound. I tried to listen, but the wind picked up, and rain started to trickle down. I was starting to think my fears were totally justified. I pulled out my gun and started walking down the trail, keeping an eye behind me. The noise faded into the sound of the rain. I rounded a corner, and there it was, lying on the ground. Ethan's band T, my face contorted like it was going to rip apart. "Woyoreo, Hyamiotiouyuoyu afkar," I screamed. "You know me," a voice whispered, so close to my neck that it felt like it had crawled up my spine. I whipped around, cocking the hammer of my gun. Nobody there. I turned back, and something hard and metallic slammed into my head. A dull ringing filled my ears, and I went down hard. I pawed for my gun, my balance completely gone. I could see the figure with the long, dark hair digging through my pack, but I was seeing double. I yelled, rolling around in the mud, pain shooting through my head. I mustered up the last bit of strength I had and tackled them, sending us both tumbling down the trail. Near one of the steeper ledges, I managed to pin them down, using my weight to my advantage. I pulled my gun up to their face, and that's when everything went white. Like someone had wiped my brain clean. No past, no future, no present. Their face was completely blank, and I was stunned. Then nothing. I woke up in the same spot. Nobody there. Rain was pouring down now. I clawed my way back up to the trail and found my backpack. I stumbled down the mountain, a ghost looking for something familiar. I somehow managed to find my truck. I looked over and saw that old red Chevy was still there. The drive home was a blur and dangerous as hell. The whole thing shook me up pretty bad. And, I gotta say, I'm pretty pissed at Sarah right now. She's insisting that it was all a hallucination, brought on by trauma. We've been arguing about it for hours. She says the head injury could have been from me just rolling around. To that, I say, then why is my hunting knife missing? Why would I hallucinate so intensely that I would throw away my own knife as a trauma response? Makes no sense. Just like those dreams I've been having. I've been waking up screaming lately. I don't remember the dreams, just fragments, phrases. One that keeps coming back is, bottom to top. Sarah wants to come with me next time, to see for herself that I'm not hallucinating. The rain washed away any sign of the struggle. The Bantee is probably long gone. And for obvious reasons, I wouldn't bring a 145 Helb woman with me when there's a violent thing up on that mountaintop somewhere. But even if all of that weren't true, there's one simple reason why I could never bring her to. Something was unlocked on that mountain, and I'm starting to remember why I was so afraid of that place. After that whole mess on the mountain, I was a wreck. Sarah kept pushing the hallucination theory, and it was driving me up the wall. We were going in circles, and honestly, it was putting a strain on things. I needed to do something, figure something out, or I was gonna lose it. So, I started digging. I figured if I could find something concrete about the area, maybe I could make sense of what happened. Or, at the very least, prove to Sarah that I wasn't crazy. First, I tried to find out more about Mr. D, but it was like hitting a brick wall. He'd retired a few years after the incident. Moved away, they said. No forwarding address. Nothing. It was like he vanished, just like Ethan. Then I started looking into the town itself. That little valley town at the foot of the mountain seemed normal enough at first glance. Friendly folks, quaint little shops, the whole 9 yards. But the more I dug, the more uneasy I felt. I started with the local library. Dusty old place, smelled like old paper and forgotten stories. I spent hours poring over old newspapers, local history books, anything I could get my hands on. Most of it was boring, everyday stuff. Birth announcements, town meetings, the occasional petty crime. But then I found something. A small article, tucked away in the back pages of a newspaper from the 1970s. It was about a group of hikers who went missing on trail. No trace of them was ever found. The article mentioned a strange mist that had rolled in just before they disappeared. Chills, man. Serious chills. I kept digging. Found a few more articles, scattered throughout the years, all about people vanishing on that same damn trail. Always the same story, experienced hikers, good weather, and then nothing. Poof, gone. Then I stumbled onto this old online forum, mostly conspiracy theorists and paranormal enthusiasts, talking about local legends and unexplained phenomena. Normally, I'd dismiss it as a bunch of crackpots, but desperate times, right? And there it was, post after post about trail and the town nearby. People calling it the Whispering Town. They talked about strange lights on the mountain, weird noises in the woods, and a general feeling of unease that hung over the place. Some even claimed the town was cursed, that it was built on some kind of ancient burial ground or something. One post, in particular, caught my eye. It was from someone who claimed to be a former resident of the town. They wrote about how the town had a secret, something they kept hidden from outsiders. They talked about rituals, sacrifices, and a presence on the mountain that demanded to be appeased. Okay, I know it sounds crazy. Even I was skeptical. But the way they described the feeling of the place, the way the residents acted, it resonated with me. It reminded me of that fisherman, and the way everyone in town seemed to be in on something I wasn't. The post ended with a warning. Stay away from Afra. It's not a place for outsiders. They don't take kindly to strangers poking around. I slammed my laptop shut. My heart was pounding. This was way more than I bargained for. I felt like I was spiraling down a rabbit hole, and I didn't know if I could find my way back out. I looked around my small apartment. My safe space was starting to feel like a cage. I needed to get back out to the mountain. I needed answers. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, looking up from her phone. "Oh," I said, my voice flat. "Sam, we talked about this," she said, standing up. "You need to." "I need to figure this out," I interrupted. "I need to know what happened to Ethan." By going back to the place where you almost got yourself killed?" she asked, her voice rising. "That's your plan?" "I have to," I said, my hand on the doorknob. Sam, please," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Just let it go. For me." I looked at her, at the woman I loved, and for a second I hesitated. But the pull of the mountain, the need to know the truth, was too strong. "I'm sorry," I said, and I walked out the door, leaving her standing there alone. I drove back towards the mountain, back towards the little town. I drove in silence, not even turning the radio on. I didn't know what I was going to do. My only thought was finding an entrance to the trail that was far away from the one I took before. Far away from any prying eyes. I ignored the entrance to the main trail. Driving up the winding mountain road, I parked at a different trailhead, miles away from the main one. It was getting dark, and the air was thick with that same sense of unease I'd felt before. I grabbed my gear, my gun, everything. This time, I was prepared. I wasn't going to let anything or anyone catch me off guard again. As I started hiking, the woods grew darker, the trees pressing in closer. The only sounds were the crunching of my boots on the trail and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I checked my map. This trail would eventually connect with the main one, the one that led to where Ethan disappeared. It would just take longer to get there. The higher I climbed, the more intense the feeling became. It was like the mountain itself was watching me, waiting. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. I kept hiking, pushing through the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. I had to know the truth. I had to find out what happened to Ethan. And as I walked deeper into the heart of the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking right into a trap. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The mountain had a hold on me now, and I was starting to understand that it wasn't going to let go without a fight. I was starting to remember piece by piece. The mountain demanded respect, and I was fresh out. The higher I climbed, the thicker the air got, not just with the chill of the approaching night, but with something else. Something heavy, oppressive. It felt like the mountain itself was pressing down on me, trying to suffocate me. But I pushed on, my boots crunching on the overgrown trail, my flashlight beam dancing ahead, swallowed by the darkness beyond its reach. I had to be close now. According to the map, this trail was about to merge with the main one, the one that led to, well, to Ethan's vanishing point. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the woods. Then I saw it, a faint glow up ahead, flickering through the trees. It wasn't the harsh white of a flashlight. This was softer, more organic, like firelight. My hand tightened around my gun. I crept forward, using the trees for cover, my senses on high alert. As I got closer, the glow grew stronger, and I could hear something now. A low, rhythmic chanting, like a prayer, but in a language I didn't understand. I peered through the trees. The trail opened into a small clearing, and in the center, around a roaring bonfire, were figures. People, dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by shadows. They were swaying back and forth, their hands raised towards the sky, chanting in that strange, guttural tongue. My blood ran cold. This was it. This was what that post on the forum was talking about. The rituals, the presence on the mountain, the whispering town's secret. I watched them, hidden in the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were maybe a dozen of them, men and women, their faces pale and gaunt in the firelight. And in the center of the circle, standing before the fire, was a figure taller than the rest. He was also robed, but his hood was pulled back, revealing a face I recognized. It was the fisherman, the one from the creek. His bushy beard seemed to glow in the firelight, his eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. He raised his hands, and the chanting grew louder, more urgent. I noticed he held my hunting knife in his right hand. Then I saw it. Beside him was a large, flat stone, like an altar. And on that stone, something was lying there. Something wrapped in what looked like Ethan's Metallica t-shirt. It was difficult to make out in the flickering light, but I saw enough. That shirt I made fun of him for wearing on the day he disappeared. Next to the shirt was a pile of bones. Small bones. My stomach churned. My legs went weak. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place, trapped between terror and a desperate need to understand. I gripped the tree I was hiding behind for support, trying to keep myself upright. The fisherman, the leader, I realized now, began to speak, his voice booming across the clearing. He spoke in English this time, his words laced with a strange accent. "We offer this to you, Ancient One," he intoned, his voice echoing through the trees. "A tribute from the depths of the earth, from bottom to top." He raised my hunting knife high above his head. I gasped. He plunged it into the bundle on the altar. I couldn't watch anymore. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, bottom to top. It was the phrase from my dreams. It was the way he'd gutted that fish. And now he was doing it to whatever was in that bundle, to the bones. I had to get out of there. I turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise. I had to escape, to warn someone, anyone. Behind me, the chanting grew louder, more frantic. I could hear them coming after me, their footsteps pounding on the trail. I ran blindly through the darkness, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I burst out of the trees and onto the main trail. I didn't even recognize where I was. I just ran, following the trail downwards, towards the valley, towards safety. The chanting grew closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder. They were gaining on me, their torches bobbing in the darkness like angry eyes. I could see their faces now, twisted in rage, their eyes wild, and I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest. I could see the lights of the town below, a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. Suddenly, a figure stepped out onto the trail in front of me, blocking my path. I skidded to a halt, raising my gun. It was Sarah. She cried, her voice filled with relief. "Thank God. Sarah, what are you doing here?" I gasped, my chest heaving. "I followed you," she said. I was worried. There was no time to argue. "We have to go," I said, grabbing her hand. "No." We ran together down the trail towards the town. The chanting grew closer, the torches drawing nearer. We burst out of the trees and into the parking lot. My Jeep was still there, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. "Get in," I yelled, throwing open the door. We scrambled inside just as the first of the robed figures emerged from the trees. I slammed the door shut, threw the Jeep into reverse, and floored it. We sped away from the mountain, away from the town, away from the darkness that had consumed it. I didn't stop driving. Not for hours. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What was there to say? We'd both seen something that night. Something that defied explanation. Something that shattered our understanding of the world. I never went back to that town. I never saw those people again. But I never forgot what I saw on that mountain. The ritual, the chanting, the fishermen, the bones. And Ethan. I finally understood what happened to him. He wasn't lost. He wasn't hurt. He was taken, offered up to something ancient and terrible that dwelled on that mountain. Sarah and I, we didn't last. The mountain and what we saw there changed us. It drove a wedge between us that we could never overcome. I tried to explain to people what happened. Police, rangers, anyone. They listened to my story, took my statement, then quietly filed it away. They humored me until I left. They probably thought I was crazy, but I knew what I saw. Now, I just drift. Another town, another trail. Always moving, always looking over my shoulder. Because I know the truth. I know what's out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for its next offering. I know that some places are not meant for human eyes, and some secrets are best left buried. I just wish I didn't have to be the one to carry the weight of this one. It all made sense now. Why I was so afraid of that place. All the little pieces I had forgotten came rushing back. My parents told me never to go near that place. It was dangerous. But we were kids and Ethan was persuasive. We were going to conquer that trail. We were going to be legends. But the mountain had other plans. It always did. And now, every time I see a mountain range, every time I hear the wind whisper through the trees, I remember the whispering town, and the mountain that demanded its due. And I remember Ethan, my friend, who was taken by the mountain, a sacrifice to an ancient evil I still can't comprehend. I should have never gone back there. I should have listened. Maybe then, things would have been different. But some trails, once you're on them, they never really let you go. They just keep pulling you back, whispering your name, until you finally give in, until you finally pay the price.
Dude, I should never have agreed to this freaking camping trip. That's all I could think, huddled in the damp, pitch black woods, straining my ears for anything at all that might give away what was lurking out there. What was out there? I didn't even know anymore. All I knew was that something was out there in the endless sea of pine trees, something that had already taken Ethan's dad. And now it was hunting us. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning, when this was just supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my buddies. God, was that only 2 days ago? Feels like a lifetime. My name's Alex, and I'm in 8th grade at Millbrook Middle School. Just your average 13-year-old kid, I guess. Not exactly the athletic type or the most popular, but I've got my crew. That's who I was with when everything went sideways. Ethan, Ben, Chris, and Sam. Ethan had been going on and on about this camping trip for weeks. His dad, Mr. Hayes, was some kind of hardcore outdoorsman and had promised to take Ethan and a few friends deep into the Adirondacks for a real wilderness experience. No phones, no iPads. Just good old-fashioned camping. Ethan was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Come on, Alex. It'll be awesome," he'd said, grinning like an idiot. "My dad's gonna teach us how to track animals, build shelters, all that survival stuff." Honestly, I was hesitant. The thought of being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by who knows what, didn't exactly fill me with joy. But peer pressure is a bitch, and eventually I caved. So there we were, piled into Mr. Hayes' massive SUV early on a crisp Friday morning in October. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the world in a riot of reds and beautiful. Instead, as we drove deeper and deeper into the wilderness, leaving civilization far behind, I felt a growing sense of unease settling in the pit of my stomach. I glanced around at my friends, wondering if any of them felt the same. Ethan, of course, was practically vibrating with excitement, his messy blonde hair bouncing as he pointed out landmarks to his dad. He'd always been the adventurous one of our group, always pushing us to try new things, take risks. Sometimes it led to awesome experiences. Other times, well, let's just say Ethan's ideas didn't always pan out. Next to Ethan sat Ben, his nose buried in a thick paperback. Classic Ben. While the rest of us were busy with sports or video games. Ben devoured books like they were going out of style. He pushed his glasses up his nose and flipped another page, completely oblivious to the world around him. In the back row with me were Chris and Sam. Chris was sound asleep, his bulky frame taking up more than his fair share of the seat. The gentle giant of our group, Chris was the kind of guy who could bench press a small car but wouldn't hurt a fly. His snores filled the car, providing an oddly comforting background noise. Sam, on the other hand, was wide awake, his dark eyes darting nervously from window to window. Out of all of us, Sam was the one I was most surprised to see on this trip. He wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type. More of a computer geek, really. Always talking about coding and AI and stuff I barely understood. But here he was, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. "You okay, Sam?" I whispered, not wanting to wake Chris or interrupt Mr. Hayes' running commentary on the local flora and fauna. Sam jumped slightly, then gave me a weak smile. "Yeah, just not used to all this nature, you know. It's so big." I nodded, understanding completely. The farther we drove, the smaller I felt, like we were being swallowed up by the vast, indifferent wilderness. After what felt like hours, Mr. Hayes finally pulled off onto a barely visible dirt road. We bounced and jolted along for another 20 minutes before he brought the car to a stop in a small clearing. "All right, boys," he boomed, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "This is where our real adventure begins. Grab your packs. We've got about a 5-mile hike to our campsite." 5 miles. Through this dense forest. I exchanged a worried glance with Sam, but there was no backing out now. We piled out of the car, shouldering our heavy backpacks. Mr. Hayes led the way, machete in hand to clear any obstacles, with Ethan right on his heels. The rest of us fell into line behind them, with me bringing up the rear. As we hiked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, damper. Strange bird calls echoed in the distance, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. But it wasn't until we were about halfway to the campsite that I first noticed something was off. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows between the trees. But there was never anything there. Just more trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I started to notice the silence. It fell suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. The next, nothing. Just the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn ground and our labored breathing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. I saw Sam's head swiveling back and forth, his eyes wide with fear. Even Chris, usually so laid back, seemed on edge. "Hey, Mr. Hayes," Ben called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is it normal for the forest to get this quiet?" Mr. Hayes paused, frowning slightly. "Well, sometimes animals will go quiet if there's a predator in the area. Bear, maybe, or a mountain lion. Nothing to worry about, boys. They're more afraid of us than we are of them." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect on me. A bear, a mountain lion. How was that supposed to make us feel better? We pressed on, the silence growing heavier with each step, and then, just as the last of the daylight was fading, we heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold and my heart leap into my throat. It was a scream, high-pitched, agonized, and very, very human. Mr. Hayes froze, his hand flying up in a gesture for us to stop. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Dad." Ethan's voice was small, scared. I'd never heard him sound like that before. "Dad, what do we do?" For a long moment, Mr. Hayes didn't move. Then he seemed to shake himself, turning to face us with a forced smile. "It's probably nothing, boys. Maybe some animal that sounds like a person. But just to be safe, we're going to set up camp right here for the night. Okay?" We nodded mutely, too scared to argue. As we started to unpack our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. We should have turned back, should have run as fast as we could back to the car and civilization. But we didn't. And as the night closed in around us, bringing with it a chorus of unnatural sounds and fleeting shadows just beyond the reach of our flashlights, I realized with growing horror that it might already be too late. We set up camp in a small clearing. The tents were placed in a tight circle around a fire pit that Mr. Hayes had started building. Fire will keep the animals away, Mr. Hayes said. Mr. Hayes, I finally worked up the courage to ask, what if that scream wasn't an animal? Shouldn't we try to help? He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Look, Alex, I know you're scared. All of you are. But trust me, there's nothing out there that we need to worry about. Probably just a fox or something. Now, let's try to get some sleep, okay? Things will look better in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake in my tent, shared with Sam, listening to the sounds of the forest. You awakes? I rolled over to face him. Yeah, can't sleep either. He shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of the moon filtering through the tent fabric. There's something wrong here, Alex. Really wrong. I've been tracking it. Tracking what? The anomalies. The electromagnetic disturbances. They're off the charts out here. That's what my device was for before Mr. Hayes took it. Alex, I don't think we're dealing with animals. I think there's something else out here. Something not natural. A sudden scream pierced the night, much closer this time. We bolted upright, our eyes wide with terror. It was followed by the sound of running feet, branches snapping, and then silence. Boys, everything okay in there? Mr. Hayes' voice came from outside, tense and alert. Before we could answer, another scream split the air. This time, I recognized the voice. It was Ethan. What happened next was a blur of chaos and sheer terror. We burst out of our tents to find Ethan's empty, a trail of disturbed undergrowth leading to the dark forest. Mr. Hayes was already charging down the path, flashlight in one hand, hunting knife in the other. Ethan, answer me, he shouted, his voice cracking with a fear I'd never heard before. We followed, stumbling blindly through the darkness, branches whipping at our faces. The beam of Mr. Hayes' flashlight danced crazily ahead of us, illuminating snippets of the forest, a gnarled root here, a flash of leaves there. And then, suddenly, the light fell on Ethan. He was standing in a small clearing, his back to us, completely motionless. Ethan, thank God, Mr. Hayes breathed, rushing forward. Are you okay? What happened? Ethan didn't respond, didn't move. As we got closer, a chill ran down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. Ethan, I called out, my voice trembling. Ethan, come on, man, you're scaring us. Slowly, so slowly, Ethan began to turn. And as his face came into view, illuminated by the harsh beam of the flashlight, I heard someone, maybe me, maybe all of us, let out a terrified scream. It wasn't Ethan. Not anymore. The thing that faced us wore Ethan's clothes, had Ethan's blonde hair. But the face was wrong. Distorted. The eyes were too large, the mouth a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. And the skin, it seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving beneath it. Run, Mr. Hayes whispered, his voice choked with horror. Run. We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush, blind with terror. Behind us I could hear something pursuing. Not footsteps, but a wet, slithering sound that seemed to come from all around us. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish flight through the dark forest. All I knew was the burning in my lungs, the sting of branches against my skin, and the overwhelming need to get away. Finally, gasping for air, we burst into another clearing. This one was different. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. At its base was a dark opening, a cave or a hollow in the trunk, I couldn't tell. In there, Mr. Hayes panted, gesturing towards the opening. Quick, before it catches up. We didn't hesitate. One by one, we squeezed through the narrow opening, finding ourselves in a spacious hollow within the tree. It was pitch black inside, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. "Is everyone here?" Mr. Hayes whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Sound off." "Here," I gasped. "Present," came Peter's shaky voice. "Yeah," stammered Sam. A grunt from Chris confirmed his presence. 5 of us. We'd lost Ethan, but the rest of us had made it. For now. Outside, we could hear something moving, circling, waiting. "Mr. Hayes," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. What was that thing?" In the darkness, I heard her. Hayes take a deep, shuddering breath. "I don't know, son. I've never seen anything like it. But I swear I'm gonna get you boys out of here. Somehow." As we huddled together in the hollow of that ancient tree, surrounded by the sounds of something inhuman prowling just outside, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever that thing was, whatever had taken Ethan, it wasn't going to give up easily. And as the long night wore on, I began to wonder, was it just Ethan it had taken? Or was it possible that none of us were who we thought we were anymore? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I pressed myself further into the damp earth of our hiding place, straining my ears for any sound that might give away the creature's location. But all I could hear was the ragged breathing of my friends and the wild pounding of my own heart. What had started as a simple camping trip had become a nightmare beyond imagination. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought began to form. What if we never made it out of these woods? As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in our wooden sanctuary, I realized that our fight for survival was only just beginning. The pale light of dawn brought little comfort. We'd spent the night huddled in that hollowed-out tree, jumping at every sound, every whisper of wind through the leaves. None of us had slept. How could we, after what we'd seen? "All right, boys," Mr. Hayes whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to make a plan. We can't stay here forever." "But what about that thing?" Ben asked, pushing his glasses up his nose with a trembling hand. "It's still out there, isn't it?" Mr. Hayes' silence was answer enough. I could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, aging him years in a single night. He was supposed to protect us, to keep us safe. But how could anyone be prepared for something like this? "We need to get back to the car," he finally said. "It's our only chance of getting out of here and finding help for Ethan." His voice caught on his son's name, and I saw a flash of raw pain cross his face before he composed himself. "But we don't even know where we are," Chris pointed out, his usual confidence replaced by fear. "We ran for who knows how long last night. We could be miles from our campsite." I might be able to help with that," Sam said hesitantly. We all turned to look at him. "Remember that device Mr. Hayes confiscated? It wasn't just for tracking anomalies. It also has GPS. Mr. Hayes' eyes widened. He quickly dug into his pocket, pulling out Sam's device. "Can you use this to get us back to the car?" Sam nodded, taking the device with reverent care. "I think so. It'll take me a few minutes to boot it up and get a signal, but..." A blood-curdling shriek cut through the morning air, so close it seemed to vibrate through the very wood around us. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. It's found us," I whispered, terror clawing at my throat. Mr. Hayes' face set in grim determination. "Okay, change of plans. Sam, you work on getting that GPS going. The rest of us are going to make a run for it. We'll try to draw it away, give Sam some time. Once you've got our location, try to make your way back to the car. If we're not there, just go. Get help." "But Mr. Hayes," I started to protest. "No arguments. Alex, it's our best chance. You think you can do this, son?" Sam gulped but nodded, his fingers already dancing over the device's screen. "Good man. All right, boys. On my mark, we run. Sam, you stay here until it's clear, understood?" We nodded, our hearts pounding in our chests. Mr. Hayes peered out of the hollow, then held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. "No!" We burst out of the tree, sprinting in the opposite direction from where we'd heard the shriek. I could hear it behind us almost immediately, that wet, slithering sound that haunted my nightmares. But we didn't look back. We couldn't. We ran until our lungs burned, weaving between trees, leaping over fallen logs. Mr. Hayes led the way, his longer strides keeping him just ahead of us. And then, without warning, he wasn't. One moment he was there, crashing through the underbrush. The next, he was gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Mr. Hayes. Ben cried out, skidding to a halt. We stopped, spinning around wildly, searching for any sign of him. There was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the forest. "We have to go back," Chris said, his voice shaking. "We can't just leave him." But even as he spoke, we heard it, that terrible, inhuman shriek, coming from the direction Mr. Hayes had vanished. It was answered by another cry, this one undoubtedly human. A scream of pure agony that cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any sound. "Oh God," Ben whimpered. "Oh God, God, oh God." I felt like I was going to be sick. Mr. Hayes was gone then, taken by whatever ungodly thing lurked in these woods, and we were alone. We need to get back to Sam, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. "We need to get out of here." The others nodded mutely, too shocked and scared to argue. We turned and began to make our way back the way we'd come, moving as quietly as we could. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through our systems. When we finally reached the hollow tree, we found Sam waiting for us, his face pale with fear. I heard the screams, he whispered. I shook my head, unable to form the words. Sam's face crumpled, but he took a deep breath and held up his device. "I've got our location," he said. "The car is about 3 miles northeast of here. But guys, there's something else you need to see." He turned the screen towards us. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at, a mess of lines and colors like some abstract painting. But then I realized what it was, a topographical map of the area. And there, right where we were standing, was a swirling vortex of energy readings, pulsing like a malevolent heart. "What is that?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not natural. And I think it might be what's behind everything that's happening here." As we stared at the pulsing anomaly on the screen, a chilling realization swept over me. We weren't just lost in the woods. We were trapped in the heart of something ancient and evil, something that had already taken 2 of our number. And as another inhuman howl echoed through the forest, closer this time, I knew with terrifying certainty that it wouldn't stop until it had all of us. "We need to move," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "No." We gathered what little supplies we had, a few granola bars, a couple of water bottles, the first aid kit from Mr. Hayes' pack. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. As we prepared to leave the relative safety of the hollow tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Splitting up had cost us Mr. Hayes. What if it cost us someone else? But what choice did we have? Staying put meant certain death. At least this way we had a fighting chance. "Okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We stick together. Sam, you lead the way. Ben, Chris, you've got the rear. I'll cover the middle. And for God's sake, if you see anything at all, yell." We stepped out of the hollow and into the forest, the pulsing energy readings on Sam's device growing stronger with each step. The woods seemed to press in on us, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, the shadows dancing with a life of their own. We walked in silence, the only sounds our own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every nerve ending in my body was on high alert, waiting for the next attack. After what felt like an eternity, Sam stopped abruptly, holding up his hand. "We're close," he whispered. The car should be just over that ridge. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. We were going to make it. We were actually going to make it out of here alive. But as we crested the ridge, our hopes were dashed. The car was there, all right, but it was no longer the shiny SUV we'd arrived in. It was a mangled wreck, twisted and torn as if it had been attacked by some giant beast. And standing beside it, their backs to us, were two figures. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the tattered remains of a familiar flannel shirt. The other was smaller, slender, with a mop of blonde hair that glinted even in the dim light. "Mr. Hayes," I whispered, hope flickering back to life. "Ethan." The figures turned, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was them, but like Ethan before, they were changed. Their eyes were black pits, their skin stretched taut over their bones, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. "Oh God," Ben breathed behind me. "They got them too." The creatures that were once our friend, and his father let out a blood-curdling shriek and charged. We scattered, diving for cover as the corrupted forms of Mr. Hayes and Ethan lunged at us. I scrambled behind a thick oak, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beside me, Ben was fumbling with the first aid kit, his hands shaking so badly he could barely open it. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice thick with panic. "I don't know," I hissed back. "Just stay down." Chris, ever the pragmatist, had grabbed a thick branch from the forest floor. He stood his ground, brandishing it like a club as Mr. Hayes stalked towards him. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice surprisingly steady. "I don't want to hurt you, Mr. Hayes." But the thing that wore Mr. Hayes' face didn't respond, didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, its black eyes fixed on Chris with chilling intensity. With a roar, Chris swung the branch, connecting with Mr. Hayes' shoulder. The creature stumbled, but it didn't go down. Instead, it let out a shriek of rage, its hand now more claw than hand, shooting out to slash at Chris's arm. Chris cried out in pain, dropping the branch. Blood welled up from a deep gash on his forearm, staining his shirt crimson. "Chris!" Sam yelled from somewhere to my left. I risked a glance and saw him, still clutching his device, frozen in place as Ethan stalked towards him. This was bad. Really bad. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped between these things and the mangled remains of our only escape route. Think. Alex, think. There had to be a way out of this. My eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything we could use to our advantage. The trees were too thin to offer any real protection. The ground was littered with rocks and branches, but nothing big enough to do any real damage. And then I saw it. The anomaly on Sam's device. It was still pulsing, stronger than ever. And it was centered right where we were standing. An idea, wild and desperate, began to form in my mind. What if the anomaly wasn't just a source of the corruption? What if it was also the key to stopping it? "Sam!" I yelled, scrambling out from behind the tree. "The device? What happens if we get them closer to the center of the anomaly?" Sam's eyes widened, understanding dawning on his face. I don't know," he stammered, "but it's worth a shot." "Okay," I said, my mind racing. "We need to lure them in. Ben, Chris, can you move?" Chris, clutching his injured arm, nodded grimly. Ben, though still pale and shaking, managed a shaky thumbs up. "All right," I said. "On my count, we make a run for it. Head towards the center of the clearing, right where the anomaly is strongest. Try to keep them between us and the signal." "Got it." They nodded, their faces set in grim determination. We were scared, injured, and exhausted, but we weren't giving up. Not yet. 1. I counted, taking a deep breath. 2. 3. We broke cover, sprinting towards the center of the clearing. Behind us, the corrupted forms of Mr. Hayes and Ethan roared in frustration, their pursuit renewed. It was a desperate gamble, a mad dash into the heart of the unknown. But as I ran, dodging grasping claws and snapping teeth, I felt a flicker of hope. We might be trapped, but we weren't defeated. Not as long as we had each other. As we reached the center of the clearing, the air grew thick and heavy, the energy from the anomaly almost palpable. It felt like running through water, each step a monumental effort. Here, I yelled, skidding to a halt. Hold them here. Chris, despite his injury, positioned himself between us and not Mr. Hayes, using his bulk to block the creature's advance. Ben, armed with nothing but a handful of rocks, stood ready to distract not Ethan. It was a chaotic, terrifying dance. We dodged and weaved, using our agility to stay just out of reach of the corrupted creatures. The air crackled with energy, the ground beneath our feet vibrated, and the whispers in the air grew louder, more insistent. "Sam," I shouted over the din. "Anything." Sam was frantically tapping at his device, his brow furrowed in concentration. I think it's working," he yelled back. "The energy is disrupting their structure. They're weakening." As if to confirm his words, Mr. Hayes stumbled, his movements becoming slower, less coordinated. Not, Ethan let out a shriek of pain, its form flickering like a bad hologram. Hope surged through me, fierce and bright. We were doing it. We were actually doing it. But our victory was short-lived. With a roar of rage, not Mr. Hayes lunged, his clawed hands swiping out and catching Chris across the chest. Chris cried out, staggering backward, his shirt ripped open to reveal 3 deep, bloody gashes. "Chris, no," I screamed, rushing to his side. He collapsed to his knees, his face pale with shock. The wounds were bad, really bad. Audio journey together. We needed to get him out of here, and fast. But as I knelt beside him, trying to staunch the bleeding with my own shirt, I realized with a sickening certainty that we were trapped. The creatures, though weakened, were still between us and the only way out. And as the corrupted forms of Mr. Hayes and Ethan closed in, their black eyes burning with a cold, alien hunger, I knew that our desperate gamble had failed. We were out of time. As the creatures advanced, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. We were trapped, injured, and out of options. This was it. This was how it ended. But then I looked at Chris, his face pale and contorted with pain, but his eyes still filled with a fierce determination. I looked at Ben, trembling but still standing, clutching his pathetic handful of rocks. I looked at Sam, his fingers flying over his device, desperately trying to find a way out, even when all hope seemed lost, and I realized something. We might be defeated, but we weren't broken. Not yet. Sam," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Is there any way to amplify the anomaly? Make it stronger?" Sam didn't even look up from his device. I don't know. It's already at maximum output. But," he paused, his fingers still flying. "There might be one way, if I can reroute the power source. But it would be dangerous. It could overload the device, cause an explosion. An explosion. It was a crazy idea, a desperate gamble. But what choice did we have? We were dead anyway. At least this way, we might take these things with us." "Do it," I said, "but give us time to get clear." Sam looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "It'll take a few minutes to reconfigure. And I'll need to stay here to trigger it manually. There's no time for a remote detonation." My blood ran cold. He was right. There wasn't enough time. Someone would have to stay behind. "No," Ben said, his voice trembling. "We're not leaving you." "We don't have a choice," Sam said, his voice surprisingly firm. "It's the only way. You guys need to go. Get out of here, get help. Tell people what happened here." "He's right," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We can't all stay. It's our only chance to stop this." Chris, who had been silent until now, struggling to catch his breath, finally spoke. "Go," he gasped. "Jet out of here. I'll buy you some time." He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. I knelt beside him, my heart aching. "Chris, you can't. Just go, Alex," he said, his voice weak but resolute. "It's okay. Just tell my mom I love her, okay?" Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. This wasn't fair. None of this was fair, but we were out of time. "All right," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Ben, help me with Chris. We need to get him as far away as possible." Together, we managed to lift Chris, supporting his weight between us. He was heavier than he looked, and every step was agony for him, but he didn't complain. He just gritted his teeth and kept moving. As we stumbled away from the center of the clearing, I looked back at Sam. He was hunched over his device, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked so young, so vulnerable, but in his eyes I saw a strength that I never knew he possessed. "Sam," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." He looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Just go, Alex." And Alex. "Yeah. Don't let this be for nothing." I nodded, unable to speak. Then, together with Ben, I turned and carried Chris away from the pulsing heart of the anomaly, away from the corrupted creatures that were once our friends, away from the brave young man who was about to sacrifice himself to save us. We didn't get far. Maybe 50 yards, maybe less. Just far enough to be out of the direct line of fire when the explosion came. It wasn't a loud bang, not like in the movies. It was more of a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. A blinding flash of light, and then silence. We turned, shielding our eyes from the afterglow. The clearing was shrouded in a thick cloud of dust and smoke. Of the alien structure, of the corrupted creatures, of Sam, there was no sign. They were gone. All of it gone. We stood there for a long moment, numb with shock and grief. We had survived, but at what cost? We had lost Ethan, Mr. Hayes, and now Sam. And Chris. I looked down at Chris, his face pale and drawn. He was still breathing, but his pulse was weak, his breath shallow. He needed medical attention, and fast. "Come on," I said to Ben, my voice hoarse. "We need to get him out of here." Together, we carried Chris through the forest, stumbling blindly in the aftermath of the explosion. The strange energy that had permeated the woods was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees seemed normal again, the shadows no longer menacing. But the damage was done. The scars of this night would stay with us forever. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled out of the woods and onto the road. We were miles from where we'd left the car, but it didn't matter. We were out. We were alive. A passing motorist found us, two scared, injured kids carrying their unconscious friend. They called for help, and soon the area was swarming with police, paramedics, and ambulances. We were taken to the hospital, treated for our injuries, questioned by the authorities. We told them everything, or at least everything we could, about the camping trip, the screams, the creatures, the anomaly, Sam's sacrifice. They listened patiently, their faces carefully neutral. But I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought we were crazy, traumatized, making up stories to cope with the deaths of our friends. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was all just a hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt it in my bones. Something alien had come to our world, something terrible and powerful. And we had stopped it for now, but at a terrible cost. As I lay in my hospital bed, staring up at the sterile white ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somewhere out there in the vast darkness of the universe, something was waiting, watching, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that one day it would return. But next time, we wouldn't be so lucky. The world moved on, as it always does. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Spring gave way to summer, and the scars of our ordeal began to fade, at least on the surface. Chris recovered, physically at least. The wounds on his chest and arm healed, leaving behind angry red lines that would forever serve as a reminder of that night. But the emotional scars ran deeper. He rarely spoke about what happened, and when he did, it was with a haunted look in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. Ben became withdrawn, retreating into the world of books even more than before. He lost himself in stories of fantasy and science fiction, perhaps seeking an escape from the reality we had faced. Or perhaps, like me, he was searching for answers. As for me, I tried to return to normal, to the life of an ordinary teenager. But normal didn't exist anymore. Not after what we'd seen, what we'd lost. The authorities never found any trace of Ethan, Mr. Hayes, or Sam. No bodies, no evidence of the alien structure, nothing. They closed the case, chalking it up to a tragic accident. A case of wild animals and overactive imaginations. But I knew the truth, and the truth was a heavy burden to bear. I spent countless hours online, scouring the internet for any information, any clue that might shed light on what we had encountered. I researched strange disappearances, unexplained phenomena, conspiracy theories. I delved into obscure scientific journals, fringe websites, and government archives, searching for anything that might resonate with our experience. And slowly, painstakingly, I began to piece together a fragmented, disturbing picture. It seemed we weren't the first to encounter this presence. There were other stories, scattered throughout history, whispered in hushed tones. Tales of strange lights in the sky, of people vanishing without a trace, of encounters with beings that defied description. And then there were the stories of places, remote and isolated, where the veil between worlds seemed to be thin. Places where the laws of physics seemed to bend, where reality itself was malleable. Places like the one we had stumbled into. My research became an obsession, consuming my waking hours and haunting my dreams. I knew I was walking a dangerous path, delving into things that were perhaps best left alone. But I couldn't stop. I owed it to Ethan, to Mr. Hayes, to Sam. I owed it to myself. One day, I came across an article that made my blood run cold. It was a report from a small town in rural Alaska, detailing a series of strange occurrences, unexplained power outages, electronic malfunctions, and a growing sense of unease among the residents. And then, the disappearances started. It was the same pattern as our encounter. The same telltale signs. They were back. I knew what I had to do. I packed a bag, using the money I'd saved from my summer job. I told my parents I was going to visit a friend for a few weeks. They didn't question me. They never did, not anymore. They knew something had changed me, that night in the woods. They just didn't know what. I contacted Ben and Chris, told them what I'd found, what I was planning to do. Ben, surprisingly, was the first to agree. He was in, no questions asked. He said he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to stop this, to prevent it from happening to anyone else. Chris took more convincing. He was scared, understandably so. But in the end, he agreed to come, too. He said he couldn't let us face this alone. He owed it to Mr. Hayes, to Ethan, to Sam. And so, we found ourselves on a plane to Alaska. 3 teenagers armed with nothing but a handful of research, a healthy dose of fear, and a burning determination to finish what we had started. We arrived in the small town under the cover of darkness, the air thick with the same unsettling energy we had felt in the Adirondacks. The residents were wary, their faces etched with worry. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what. We started our investigation, following the trail of disappearances, interviewing the locals, searching for any clues that might lead us to the source of the disturbance. And then, we found it. Deep in the wilderness, miles from the town, we discovered another anomaly, pulsing with the same malevolent energy as the one we had encountered before. But this time, it was bigger, stronger, more deeply rooted. And it was guarded. Not by corrupted humans this time, but by things that defied description. Creatures of shadow and light, shifting and swirling, their forms constantly changing. They were like nothing we had ever seen before, and they were clearly not of this world. We knew then that we were outmatched, outgunned. We were just 3 teenagers, armed with nothing but our wits and our courage. We had no chance of defeating these things. But we couldn't just run. We couldn't just abandon these people to the same fate that had befallen our friends. As the creatures closed in, I knew that we had a choice to make. We could fight, and likely die. Or we could try something else, something even more desperate. I looked at Ben, at Chris, and in their eyes, I saw the same grim understanding. We were in this together, until the end. We can't stop them, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. but maybe we can contain them. I told them my plan, a wild, crazy idea that had formed in my mind during the long flight to Alaska. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all we had. We put our plan into action, using everything we had learned, everything we had experienced, to try and turn the anomaly against itself. It was a race against time, a battle of wills against an ancient, alien intelligence. And as the creatures closed in, their forms flickering and distorting in the pulsing light of the anomaly, I knew that this was it. Our final stand. We fought with everything we had, not with weapons, but our wills, our very humanity. We poured all our fear, our anger, our grief, our hope into the anomaly, trying to bend it to our will, to force it to close. And slowly, miraculously, it began to work. The anomaly pulsed, flickered, and then, with a blinding flash of light, it collapsed in on itself, shrinking, vanishing, until nothing remained but the silent, empty forest. The creatures were gone. The energy was gone. The threat, for now, was contained on it. We had somehow, against all odds, managed to close the door once more. But as we stood there, exhausted, battered, and bruised, I knew that this was not the end. It was merely a reprieve. The veil between worlds was thin, and there were things out there, ancient and powerful, that were always searching for a way in. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As we made our way back to civilization, I knew that our lives would never be the same. We had seen too much, lost too much, changed too much. But we had also found something within ourselves, something strong and resilient. We had faced the darkness, and we had not blinked. We were the survivors, the witnesses, the guardians. And as long as we drew breath, we would be ready to stand against the darkness, to protect our world from the things that lurked beyond. Because that's what it means to be human. To fight, to hope, to survive, and to never, ever give up, even when the odds are stacked against you. Even when the darkness seems overwhelming, we would be ready, always.